In the modern imagination, the word conspiracy often evokes secrecy, paranoia, and hidden plots uncovered long after the fact. Yet, in medieval Europe, conspiracies were not always hidden. Many operated openly, embedded within religious doctrine, legal systems, and royal authority. They were not fringe beliefs, but structural assumptions, quietly shaping daily life for millions. To understand medieval conspiracies, we must first discard the modern idea that truth was something to be questioned. In medieval society, truth was inherited. It flowed downward from God, through scripture, through the church, and finally through kings and lords. Questioning that flow was not skepticism. It was rebellion. This documentary explores the systems, beliefs, and coordinated structures that medieval people lived inside. Conspiracies not as fantasies, but as functioning realities. We begin with the most powerful institution of the medieval world, the church. By the early Middle Ages, the church had become the primary authority on knowledge itself. Literacy was almost entirely confined to clergy. Scripture was written and interpreted in Latin, a language inaccessible to ordinary people. This created a closed system of interpretation where spiritual truth could only be accessed through approved intermediaries. The idea that salvation depended on obedience to church doctrine was not merely preached. It was enforced socially, economically, and sometimes violently. Excommunication meant more than religious exclusion. It meant isolation from trade, community, and legal protection. Entire villages could be punished for the perceived sins of individuals. In this system, the church controlled not only belief but fear. The fear of hell was detailed vividly in sermons, art, and literature. Eternal punishment was described with graphic specificity, while salvation remained deliberately vague. This imbalance was not accidental. It ensured compliance. Indulgences, which allowed sins to be reduced through payment or service, became a structured economic mechanism. While often framed as charitable offerings, indulgences functioned as a monetized forgiveness system. The idea that spiritual debt could be managed financially was widely accepted, even by those who suffered under it. This was not a secret plot. It was an openly acknowledged system. Yet, from a modern perspective, it resembles a coordinated narrative designed to maintain institutional dominance. Beyond theology, conspiratorial thinking also shaped medieval law. Justice in medieval Europe was rarely evidence-based. Instead, it relied on divine judgment. Trial by ordeal through fire, water, or combat was based on the belief that God would reveal innocence through survival. This transferred responsibility away from human judges and into an abstract divine authority that could not be questioned. If someone drowned during a water ordeal, their guilt was confirmed, regardless of reality. If they survived, innocence was declared. The system required no investigation, only belief. Legal conspiracies extended further. Laws were often written in ways that protected the elite while appearing divinely ordained. Peasants were taught that social hierarchy reflected God's will. Poverty was not injustice. It was destiny. This belief was reinforced from childhood. Sermons emphasized humility. Art depicted peasants as morally simple and spiritually pure, while rebellion was portrayed as sinful pride. Over generations, this narrative became internalized. Perhaps the most enduring medieval conspiracy was the myth of the divinely chosen king. Monarchs ruled not merely by force, but by spiritual legitimacy. Coronation rituals included holy anointing, symbolizing God's direct approval. To oppose the king was not just treason, it was heresy. This belief allowed rulers to demand loyalty even in times of famine, war, or misrule. Failures were blamed on divine testing, not leadership. Revolts were framed as moral corruption rather than political resistance. Even when kings were clearly incompetent, the narrative remained intact. Chroniclers, often employed by royal courts or monasteries, recorded events selectively. Victories were emphasized, defeats were justified. History itself became a controlled narrative. The result was a population conditioned to accept suffering as sacred. Medieval conspiracies were not always imposed from above. Sometimes they emerged from fear. Minority groups, particularly Jewish communities, were frequently accused of secret plots. Blood libel myths claimed ritual murder. Well-poisoning accusations arose during plagues. These beliefs had no factual basis, yet they spread rapidly through sermons and rumors. Authorities often tolerated or encouraged these accusations as they redirected public anger away from governance failures. Pogroms were justified as moral cleansing. Property was seized. Debts were erased. Again, this was not hidden. It was socially sanctioned violence, rationalized through false narratives that benefited those in power. Even knowledge itself was controlled. Universities, where they existed, taught approved texts almost exclusively. Aristotle was filtered through church interpretation. Scientific inquiry was acceptable only when it reinforced theological conclusions. Ideas that contradicted doctrine were labeled dangerous, not because they were disproven, but because they destabilized authority. This created a self-reinforcing intellectual system. Scholars who challenged it risked reputation, livelihood, or worse. Silence became survival. Taken together, these systems formed a network of beliefs that shaped how medieval people understood reality. They were not conspiracies in the modern cinematic sense. There were no secret meetings in candlelit rooms plotting domination. Instead, these were conspiracies of assumption, widely accepted narratives that served power by remaining unquestioned. Understanding this does not require moral judgment. Medieval people lived within the limits of their world. Most had no access to alternative explanations. Their obedience was not stupidity, it was adaptation. Yet recognizing these structures helps explain how Europe functioned for centuries, and how authority maintains itself not only through force, but through belief. And as we continue, we will examine how some of these medieval conspiracies began to fracture, quietly, slowly, setting the stage for reform, rebellion, and the eventual transformation of European society. As medieval Europe moved slowly toward the late Middle Ages, the conspiratorial structures that once appeared immovable began to show subtle fractures. These changes did not arrive suddenly, nor were they announced as revolutions. Instead, they emerged quietly through administrative necessity, economic strain, and unintended consequences of authority itself. One of the earliest stress points appeared within the Church's own bureaucracy. By the 13th century, the Church had grown into a vast administrative institution spanning kingdoms and cultures, managing doctrine, taxation, land ownership, and clerical appointments required written records on an unprecedented scale. This expansion produced a paradox. The very system designed to control knowledge began to multiply it. Cathedral schools and universities trained clerics not only in theology, but in logic, law, and classical texts. While still supervised, these institutions introduced structured debate. Students were encouraged to analyze contradictions in scripture and philosophy, not to challenge doctrine, but to defend it more effectively. Yet the habit of questioning, once learned, could not always be contained. Scholasticism, particularly in universities such as Paris and Oxford, formalized reasoning itself. Arguments were dissected. Premises were examined. Conclusions had to follow logically. Though intended to strengthen religious authority, this method subtly shifted respect away from pure obedience and toward intellectual coherence. For the first time, authority could be quietly evaluated rather than simply accepted. Economic transformation further weakened medieval conspiratorial systems. The growth of trade routes connected towns across Europe. Merchants accumulated wealth independent of land ownership, disrupting the rigid feudal hierarchy. Money, unlike land, moved freely, crossed borders, created new forms of influence. Urban centers developed their own legal customs, often negotiated directly with kings eager for tax revenue. Town charters granted rights previously reserved for nobles. This erosion of feudal dependence altered how people understood power. Authority was no longer exclusively inherited. It could be negotiated. The church itself became financially entangled with these changes. Loans, interest, and credit networks complicated theological positions on usury. While doctrine officially condemned lending at interest, enforcement was inconsistent. Exceptions multiplied. Moral clarity blurred. This inconsistency did not go unnoticed. The Black Death accelerated these pressures dramatically. When plague swept across Europe in the mid-14th century, it killed indiscriminately. Clergy died alongside peasants. Monasteries emptied. Rituals failed to stop the disease. Prayer did not guarantee survival. For a population raised to believe that obedience ensured divine protection, this was profoundly destabilizing. The church offered explanations, punishment, testing, mystery, but none restored certainty. Labor shortages empowered surviving workers. Wages rose. Serfs abandoned obligations. Attempts to enforce pre-plague social structures often failed. Rebellion became more frequent, not as ideological revolt, but as practical resistance. The conspiratorial belief that hierarchy reflected divine order began to weaken, replaced by lived experience contradicting doctrine. Yet medieval conspiracies did not simply dissolve. Many adapted. Royal authority absorbed religious symbolism more aggressively. Kings emphasized sacred lineage. Legal systems became more centralized, reducing reliance on divine judgment rituals and increasing bureaucratic control. Power shifted from spiritual intermediaries to administrative ones. This transition replaced one form of unquestioned authority with another. Meanwhile, chroniclers continued to shape narratives. History remained selective. Events unfavorable to rulers were minimized or reframed. Literacy increased slowly, but interpretation remained constrained. The most enduring conspiratorial mechanism, control of narrative, survived intact. Perhaps the clearest illustration of medieval conspiratorial thinking lies in how dissent was categorized. Challenges to authority were rarely addressed on practical terms. Instead, they were labeled morally or spiritually deviant. Political opposition became heresy. Economic protest became sin. This framing allowed institutions to neutralize threats without engaging their substance. It was not necessary to prove dissent wrong. It only needed to be condemned. Such mechanisms would not disappear with the Middle Ages. They would evolve, secularize, and reappear in different forms. Understanding medieval conspiracies, then, is not an exercise in judgment, but in recognition. These systems reveal how societies maintain stability, how belief becomes infrastructure, and how power persists not only through force, but through shared assumptions. As Europe transitioned toward early modernity, many medieval structures collapsed. Others transformed seamlessly, shedding religious language while preserving function. The legacy of medieval conspiracies is not confined to the past. It resides in how authority still seeks legitimacy, how narratives are curated, and how obedience is framed as order rather than control. In the next section, we will examine how the collapse of medieval certainty paved the way for new forms of institutional secrecy, and how the end of one age quietly prepared the foundations of another. As medieval Europe moved closer to the threshold of the early modern world, the gradual collapse of inherited certainty did not produce clarity. Instead, it produced anxiety. When long-standing explanations failed, societies did not immediately replace them with rational systems. They searched for substitutes, and in that search, new forms of conspiratorial thinking emerged, quieter, more institutional, and often more durable than those of the Middle Ages. One of the most significant shifts occurred in the nature of authority itself. During the medieval period, power had been justified primarily through divine sanction. Kings ruled because God willed it. The Church governed souls because salvation required obedience. As these claims weakened, authority sought alternative foundations. Law, bureaucracy, and written procedure began to replace ritual and theology as instruments of control. This transition created the illusion of transparency. Written records, standardized courts, and codified laws suggested fairness and consistency. Yet these systems were no less exclusive. Literacy remained limited. Legal language became specialized. Access to justice required money, connections, or patronage. What changed was not control, but its appearance. Where medieval conspiracies relied on shared belief, emerging early modern systems relied on complexity. Ordinary people no longer needed to believe in divine judgment. They only needed to accept that authority was too intricate to question. This shift was especially visible in taxation. Medieval taxation had often been arbitrary, justified through obligation rather than explanation. As states centralized, taxes became standardized and bureaucratically managed. Records were kept. Accounts were balanced. Yet the logic behind taxation remained inaccessible to those who paid it. The belief that such systems were neutral and necessary replaced earlier notions of divine will. Resistance became illegal rather than sinful. Punishment became administrative rather than spiritual. In effect, conspiracy moved from the pulpit to the ledger. Another transformation occurred in the management of fear. In medieval Europe, fear had been overt. Hell was depicted graphically. Punishment was eternal and vividly described. As theological authority weakened, fear became subtler. It was embedded in law enforcement, surveillance, and social reputation. Accusations still destroyed lives, but they were framed as legal concerns rather than moral ones. Heresy trials evolved into prosecutions for sedition or disorder. The mechanism remained identical. Dissent was criminalized through narrative framing. What distinguished this new phase was deniability. Institutions no longer needed to claim divine authority. They claimed procedural necessity. Decisions were presented as outcomes of systems rather than choices made by individuals. Responsibility dissolved into structure. This allowed conspiratorial systems to operate without appearing conspiratorial at all. Knowledge, too, underwent transformation. The expansion of printing increased access to information, but it also multiplied control mechanisms. Censorship did not disappear. It became selective. Licensing systems determined what could be published. Indexes listed forbidden texts. Ideas were filtered rather than erased. The result was a controlled marketplace of knowledge. People encountered a wider range of information, but only within boundaries set by authority. This produced the impression of intellectual freedom while preserving institutional dominance. The medieval conspiracy of restricted literacy was replaced by the early modern conspiracy of curated knowledge. Yet it is important to understand that these developments were not orchestrated by shadowy figures. They emerged organically from attempts to stabilize societies under strain. Institutions responded to crisis with systems that prioritized order over transparency. Conspiracy, in this sense, does not require intention. It requires alignment between power, narrative, and exclusion. By the time Europe entered the 17th century, the medieval world had largely disappeared. Feudal obligations weakened, religious unity fractured, scientific inquiry expanded, yet many foundational assumptions remained intact. Authority still presented itself as necessary and inevitable. Narratives still justified inequality. Systems still discouraged interrogation by framing complexity as expertise. The medieval period, often dismissed as an age of superstition, reveals something more enduring. It shows how societies construct reality through belief, how institutions normalize their own dominance, and how control often persists not through deception, but through consensus. Understanding medieval conspiracies, then, is not about uncovering hidden plots. It is about recognizing patterns that repeat whenever power depends on unquestioned assumptions. As we move forward, these patterns will continue to evolve. They will shed religious language, adopt secular rationales, and embed themselves within modern institutions. But their core function remains unchanged. They explain the world in ways that protect authority. They simplify complexity in ways that discourage resistance. And they endure precisely because they do not appear conspiratorial at all. As Europe settled into the early modern period, the remnants of medieval conspiratorial thinking did not vanish. Instead, they became increasingly abstract. Where medieval authority had relied on visible hierarchy and shared religious belief, early modern authority depended on systems that appeared impersonal, rational, and inevitable. This transition marked one of the most important shifts in how power concealed itself. One of the clearest examples of this transformation can be found in the evolution of legal authority. Medieval justice had been openly symbolic. Trials by ordeal and divine judgment made no claim to objectivity. They relied entirely on belief. Early modern legal systems, by contrast, emphasized procedure. Evidence, testimony, and written records became central. Courts appeared methodical and neutral, yet this neutrality was largely performative. Legal language grew increasingly technical, inaccessible to those without formal education. Judges and magistrates interpreted laws that ordinary people could neither read nor understand. The system did not require belief in divine justice. It required submission to expertise. In effect, authority no longer needed to persuade. It only needed to process. This development represented a new form of conspiratorial structure, one that hid behind complexity. Decisions were justified not by moral reasoning, but by adherence to rules whose origins were rarely questioned. Responsibility became diffused across institutions, making accountability nearly impossible to locate. The same pattern emerged in governance. Medieval rulers ruled visibly. Their courts were physical spaces. Their power was embodied in ritual and presence. Early modern states, however, increasingly governed through correspondence, bureaucracy, and record-keeping. Power was exercised through documents rather than declarations. For the population, this meant that authority became harder to identify and harder to resist. Orders arrived in written form, stamped with seals, backed by distant institutions. The source of decision-making grew opaque. This opacity functioned as a stabilizing force. People obeyed not because they trusted rulers, but because they could not locate alternatives. Economic systems followed a similar trajectory. As medieval guilds declined and market economies expanded, economic authority shifted away from communal regulation and toward centralized oversight. Prices, wages, and trade policies were increasingly influenced by distant authorities rather than local consensus. The belief that markets operated according to natural laws replaced earlier notions of moral economy. Suffering caused by economic decisions was framed as unavoidable rather than unjust. This framing discouraged resistance. If hardship was the result of impersonal forces, there was no one to blame. Here, medieval conspiracies of divine hierarchy evolved into early modern conspiracies of inevitability. Religion itself adapted to this new environment. While religious unity fractured during the Reformation, religious authority did not disappear. Instead, it diversified. Competing institutions each claimed exclusive access to truth. The result was not freedom from dogma, but proliferation of dogmas. Individuals were expected to choose allegiance, not question structure. Disagreement became a matter of faction rather than inquiry. This fragmentation created fertile ground for fear-based narratives. Accusations of hidden enemies, internal corruption, and secret plots intensified. Witch hunts, for example, reflected deep anxiety about invisible threats operating within communities. These fears were not irrational fantasies. They were attempts to explain instability in a world where authority had become abstract and impersonal. When systems feel uncontrollable, societies search for human agents to blame. In this way, conspiratorial thinking reasserted itself during moments of transition. Yet the key difference between medieval and early modern conspiracies lay in visibility. Medieval conspiracies were overt. They were taught openly. Early modern conspiracies were subtle. They were embedded within systems that claimed neutrality. This subtlety made them more resilient. By the 18th century, Enlightenment thinkers would begin to challenge these structures directly, arguing for transparency, reason, and accountability. But even these challenges often reproduced the same assumptions under different language. The belief that rational systems naturally produce justice replaced the belief that divine systems do so. Authority remained centralized. Expertise replaced priesthood. Complexity replaced mystery. The medieval world, therefore, did not simply end. Transformed. Conspiracies did not dissolve. They matured. They learned to survive without belief, relying instead on habit, structure, and resignation. Understanding this continuity allows us to see medieval conspiracies not as relics of superstition, but as early expressions of a recurring human pattern. When power becomes difficult to challenge, it justifies itself through narratives that discourage questioning. Whether framed as divine will, legal necessity, economic law, or administrative procedure, the result is the same. Authority becomes invisible, and invisibility is its greatest protection. As authority became increasingly invisible, the population's relationship with power changed in subtle but profound ways. Medieval obedience had been personal. One knew the Lord who collected taxes, the priest who preached doctrine, the magistrate who passed judgment. Early modern obedience, by contrast, became abstract. Power was encountered through documents, regulations, and institutions rather than individuals. This abstraction altered how responsibility was perceived. When authority was personal, failure could be blamed on a ruler, a bishop, or a local official. When authority became systemic, failure appeared structural. Hunger, unemployment, or injustice were no longer the result of individual decisions, but of forces presented as beyond human control. This reframing did not eliminate suffering. It removed accountability. In medieval Europe, conspiratorial systems relied on belief to function. People obeyed because they believed obedience was morally or spiritually required. In the early modern world, obedience increasingly relied on resignation. People complied not because they believed systems were just, but because they seemed unavoidable. This shift marked a critical evolution in how conspiracies operate. The most effective conspiratorial structures do not demand belief. They demand acceptance. Education illustrates this transition clearly. Medieval education was openly exclusive. Only certain people were meant to learn. Knowledge was sacred, guarded, and hierarchical. Early modern education expanded, but it also standardized. Curricula were regulated. Subjects were prioritized according to state or institutional needs. Critical inquiry was encouraged within narrow boundaries. Students learned how to reason, but not always what to question. This produced a population capable of complex thought, yet conditioned to apply that thought only within approved frameworks. Intellectual freedom increased in form, while remaining constrained in function. The illusion of openness replaced overt restriction. Similar patterns appeared in historical memory. As states grew stronger, they invested more heavily in controlling how the past was recorded and remembered. Official histories emphasized continuity, legitimacy, and progress. Disruptive events were reframed as necessary transitions. Failures were attributed to external threats rather than internal flaws. This narrative control did not require falsification. It required selection. By choosing which events to emphasize and which to minimize, institutions shaped collective understanding without appearing deceptive. Over time, these curated histories became accepted truth. The medieval chronicler had written for a patron. The early modern historian wrote for a nation. Both served power, though in different forms. Religion continued to play a role, even as secular authority expanded. While theological dominance declined, moral frameworks rooted in religious tradition persisted. Concepts such as obedience, duty, and sacrifice were secularized and applied to the state. Loyalty to God was transformed into loyalty to nation or crown. This continuity allowed older conspiratorial assumptions to survive under new language. The belief that suffering served a higher purpose did not disappear. It was repurposed. Sacrifice became patriotic rather than spiritual. Endurance became civic virtue. Again, the mechanism remained intact while its justification evolved. Crucially, resistance did not disappear either. Throughout this period, individuals and communities continued to question authority, often intuitively rather than ideologically. Peasant uprisings, urban protests, and labor disputes persisted. However, these movements were increasingly fragmented. Without a shared explanatory framework, resistance struggled to coalesce. Conspiratorial systems thrive in such fragmentation. When people experience injustice but lack a coherent narrative to explain it, their responses remain local and temporary. Structural critique becomes difficult when structure itself is obscured. By the time Europe approached the modern era, the medieval world was often portrayed as a primitive past, an age of superstition overcome by reason. This narrative itself functioned as a form of concealment. By framing progress as linear and inevitable, it discouraged examination of continuity. It suggested that old forms of control had been replaced by enlightened systems, rather than transformed into subtler ones. This belief remains powerful. Yet medieval conspiracies reveal something essential about how societies operate across time. They show that control does not depend solely on secrecy. It depends on normalization. When systems become familiar, they become invisible. The medieval peasant did not experience the church's authority as a conspiracy. It was simply reality. Likewise, modern individuals rarely perceive bureaucratic systems as conspiratorial. They are experienced as background conditions of life. Understanding medieval conspiracies, therefore, requires a shift in perspective. It requires us to see power not as a hidden plot, but as a shared story, one repeated so often that it no longer appears constructed. In this sense, the medieval period offers more than historical insight. It provides a framework for understanding how authority sustains itself across centuries, adapting to new circumstances while preserving core functions. As we move forward, the distinction between medieval and modern begins to blur. The tools change, the language evolves, but the fundamental relationship between power, narrative, and obedience remains strikingly consistent. In the final sections, we will draw these threads together, examining what medieval conspiracies ultimately reveal about human societies, and why their lessons continue to resonate long after the Middle Ages have passed into history. When examining medieval conspiracies through this broader lens, one conclusion becomes unavoidable. The most powerful systems of control are rarely experienced as oppression by those living within them. Instead, they are perceived as order, stability, the natural arrangement of the world. This perception was carefully cultivated. In medieval Europe, from childhood onward, individuals were immersed in a narrative that explained their place in society as both inevitable and meaningful. Birth determined status. Labor defined worth. Obedience promised spiritual security. Each element reinforced the others, creating a closed loop of justification. What made this system so effective was not coercion alone, but coherence. The world made sense. Suffering had purpose. Authority had legitimacy. Within such a framework, alternatives were not merely undesirable. They were unimaginable. This is why medieval conspiracies were so resilient. They did not rely on secrecy. They relied on consensus. Even moments of resistance often reinforced the system they opposed. Rebellions were typically framed in moral rather than structural terms. Peasants protested corrupt officials, unjust taxes, or immoral clergy, not the legitimacy of hierarchy itself. Kings were criticized for failing to live up to divine standards, not for claiming divine authority. In this way, dissent operated inside the existing narrative rather than outside it. The system could absorb criticism without collapsing. This capacity for absorption is one of the defining characteristics of durable power structures. They allow limited opposition, channel it, and neutralize it without altering fundamental assumptions. Medieval conspiracies demonstrate this principle with remarkable clarity. Consider the role of reform movements. Throughout the Middle Ages, calls for reform emerged repeatedly within the Church. Critics condemned corruption, excess, and moral decay. Monastic orders emphasized poverty and discipline. Preachers called for spiritual renewal. Yet these movements rarely challenged the Church's authority itself. They sought purification, not dismantling. As a result, reform often strengthened institutional legitimacy by portraying problems as deviations rather than symptoms. The conspiracy of authority survived by presenting itself as self-correcting. This pattern extended to governance. Feudal obligations were frequently renegotiated in times of crisis. Lords granted concessions. Kings issued charters. Rights were acknowledged selectively. These adjustments alleviated pressure while preserving hierarchy. Power adapted without surrendering its foundation. Such adaptability complicates modern attempts to identify medieval conspiracies as deliberate manipulation. These systems were not engineered by a single group with malicious intent. They evolved through centuries of interaction between belief, necessity, and survival. Yet their effects were no less real for being unintentional. By shaping how people understood reality, medieval conspiracies constrained the range of possible thought and action. They limited not only behavior but imagination. This limitation is perhaps their most enduring legacy. Even today, historical narratives often portray medieval people as uniquely gullible or naive. This portrayal itself functions as a protective myth. By attributing past control to ignorance, it reassures modern audiences that they are immune. History suggests otherwise. Every society constructs explanations that make existing arrangements appear natural. Every era produces narratives that discourage fundamental questioning. Medieval conspiracies were simply more visible in their reliance on religion and ritual. Modern systems rely on abstraction, expertise, and institutional complexity. The difference is aesthetic, not structural. Understanding medieval conspiracies, then, requires humility. It requires recognizing that people in the past were neither fools nor victims in the simplistic sense. They navigated the world as best they could within the frameworks available to them. Those frameworks, however, were shaped by power. This realization reframes the medieval period not as a cautionary tale of superstition, but as a case study in how human societies organize belief to sustain order. It reveals how authority embeds itself in everyday life, how narratives become invisible through repetition, and how control persists even as forms change. As we draw toward the conclusion of this documentary, the significance of medieval conspiracies becomes clearer. They remind us that the line between truth and narrative is often maintained by institutions, not evidence. They show that legitimacy is constructed, reinforced, and defended through shared assumptions. And they demonstrate that the most effective conspiracies are those that do not feel like conspiracies at all. The medieval world may be distant in time, but its structures echo forward. They inform how we understand obedience, authority, and normality. They challenge the comforting belief that progress alone dissolves power. Instead, history suggests that power adapts. It sheds old language. It adopts new justifications, and it continues. In the final passage, we will reflect on why medieval conspiracies continue to fascinate modern audiences, and what their persistence reveals about our own relationship with authority, belief, and control. The enduring fascination with medieval conspiracies lies not in their strangeness, but in their familiarity. Despite the distance of centuries, the structures that govern medieval life continue to resonate because they reflect enduring patterns in human organization. The medieval world offers a mirror, not of a primitive past, but of recurring dynamics that persist whenever authority seeks permanence. One reason medieval conspiracies remain compelling is that they operated without the language of deception. They did not describe themselves as manipulative or coercive. They described themselves as necessary. This distinction matters. When power presents itself as necessity, it becomes difficult to oppose without appearing irrational or dangerous. Medieval people were taught that hierarchy preserved cosmic order. Disorder threatened not just society, but creation itself. To question authority was to risk chaos. This framing discouraged opposition more effectively than force alone ever could. Importantly, medieval conspiracies were not sustained solely from above. They were reinforced horizontally through community, tradition, and habit. Families transmitted beliefs to children. Neighbors monitored one another's behavior. Social survival depended on conformity. In such an environment, deviation carried immediate consequences. Exclusion, suspicion, or accusation could destroy livelihoods. This social reinforcement meant that institutional narratives did not require constant enforcement. They maintained themselves. This is one of the most powerful lessons of medieval conspiracies. Control is most effective when communities internalize it. Over time, these internalized beliefs became indistinguishable from common sense. People did not experience them as imposed ideas. They experienced them as reality. This process explains why medieval conspiracies endured for centuries despite their inconsistencies and contradictions. When beliefs are shared widely enough, contradictions lose significance. What matters is not coherence, but consensus. The gradual erosion of medieval authority did not occur because people suddenly recognized deception. It occurred because lived experience began to diverge too sharply from inherited explanation. Plague, economic change, and social mobility disrupted the narrative's ability to explain suffering. Even then, collapse was slow. Institutions adapted. Narratives shifted. Authority reasserted itself under new forms. The medieval world dissolved not through exposure, but through transformation. This transformation underscores a crucial point. Conspiratorial systems rarely end. They evolve. They replace explicit justification with implicit assumption. They trade ritual for regulation. They exchange theology for technical language. Yet their function remains consistent: to render power normal, unquestioned, and stable. For modern audiences, medieval conspiracies are often consumed as curiosities. They are framed as dark episodes overcome by enlightenment. This framing is comforting. It suggests that such systems belong to the past. But history does not support this interpretation. Instead, medieval conspiracies demonstrate how deeply narrative shapes perception. They show how authority embeds itself not merely in institutions, but in thought itself. They reveal how people come to defend systems that limit them because those systems provide meaning, order, and predictability. This is not a failure of intelligence. It is a response to uncertainty. Human societies consistently prioritize stability over truth when the two appear to conflict. Medieval conspiracies thrived because they offered explanations that made life intelligible. In a world of hardship and unpredictability, certainty was invaluable. The danger lies not in seeking order, but in mistaking constructed narratives for inevitability. This danger did not disappear with the Middle Ages. It persists whenever complexity is used to discourage inquiry. Whenever expertise replaces accountability, whenever systems present themselves as too vast, too technical, or too necessary to question. The medieval period, therefore, is not an anomaly. It is a foundation. By studying medieval conspiracies, we gain insight into how authority survives change. We learn that power does not require secrecy to endure. It requires participation. It requires repetition. It requires belief, or at least acquiescence. Perhaps the most unsettling realization is this: medieval conspiracies were effective because they aligned with genuine human needs. They offered identity, belonging, and explanation. They answered questions about suffering, purpose, and order. Any system that does the same will attract loyalty, regardless of its consequences. As this documentary concludes, it leaves us not with answers, but with perspective. Medieval conspiracies are not relics to be mocked or dismissed. They are lessons in how societies organize meaning, how authority legitimizes itself, and how easily narratives become invisible once they are shared. The Middle Ages remind us that history is not a sequence of awakenings, but a continuum of adaptation. Power learns, it refines, persists, and understanding this does not weaken societies. It strengthens them, because awareness is the first step toward choice. Not rebellion, not rejection, but understanding. To fully appreciate what medieval conspiracies reveal, we must pause on one final, often overlooked element: silence. Not the silence imposed by censorship or fear, but the silence created by habit. In medieval Europe, many ideas were never spoken aloud because they did not yet exist as concepts. This absence was not enforced. It was structural. Most medieval people did not ask whether hierarchy was justified, whether authority could be decentralized, or whether belief itself could be optional. These questions belonged to a conceptual universe that had not yet formed. Power did not need to suppress such thoughts. It only needed to ensure they were never named. This is the quietest and most effective form of conspiratorial control. By shaping what could be imagined, medieval systems shaped what could be desired. Language played a crucial role in this process. Words defined reality. There were terms for obedience, sin, duty, and transgression, but few for systemic injustice or abstract rights. Without language to describe alternatives remained unreachable. Even rebellion was linguistically constrained. Revolts were framed as restorations of proper order, not creations of new ones. Protesters claimed that authority had strayed from divine law, not that divine law itself was flawed. In doing so, they reaffirmed the very framework they resisted. This pattern reveals why medieval conspiracies endured so long without exposure. They did not hide truth, they defined it. Modern audiences often search medieval history for villains, corrupt popes, cruel lords, manipulative kings. While such figures existed, focusing on individuals obscures the larger reality. Medieval conspiracies were systemic. They were sustained not by malicious intent, but by collective participation. Everyone had a role. Clergy reinforced doctrine. Nobles enforced hierarchy. Communities enforced conformity. Even victims often defended the system that constrained them because it offered coherence in an uncertain world. This collective dimension complicates moral judgment. It invites analysis instead. When conspiracies are shared widely enough, they cease to feel conspiratorial. They become culture. This is why medieval conspiracies cannot be dismantled simply by exposing falsehoods. Their power did not depend on factual accuracy alone. It depended on emotional resonance, social reinforcement, and existential reassurance. These qualities made them resilient to contradiction. As Europe moved further into the modern era, many medieval structures dissolved, but the logic behind them remained active. Authority continued to rely on narratives that framed obedience as rational, necessary, or inevitable. Complexity replaced mystery. Expertise replaced sanctity. Systems replaced individuals. Yet the function was unchanged. Medieval conspiracies teach us that power is most stable when it is normalized, when it aligns with daily routines, and when it answers questions people are already asking. They reveal that control does not require constant enforcement. It requires alignment between belief and survival. This insight carries implications beyond history. Whenever institutions explain inequality as natural, suffering as unavoidable, or authority as neutral, they echo medieval patterns. Whenever narratives discourage fundamental questioning by framing it as dangerous, impractical, or irresponsible, they draw from the same logic. The medieval world reminds us that such systems feel strongest precisely when they feel ordinary. For Tier 1 audiences today, this realization offers something rare: historical distance paired with psychological proximity. Medieval conspiracies are safe to examine because they are distant, yet unsettling because they are familiar. They allow us to study power without immediate defensiveness. And in doing so, they offer a form of quiet education not about medieval people but about human societies more broadly. History, in this sense, becomes a tool for reflection rather than judgment. It shows us patterns rather than prescriptions. It invites awareness without demanding action. This aligns with the deeper purpose of long-form historical listening. In slow, uninterrupted narration, the mind is given space to connect ideas without urgency. Insight emerges not through shock, but through accumulation. The medieval period rewards this approach. Its conspiracies were not dramatic revelations. They were gradual constructions. They unfolded over centuries. They shaped lives invisibly, and they dissolved not through exposure, but through transformation. Understanding them requires patience. As this documentary continues, it does not seek to alarm or persuade. It seeks to illuminate, to show how power, belief, and narrative intertwine across time, to demonstrate that the past is neither foolish nor distant, but structurally instructive. In recognizing medieval conspiracies for what they were, shared systems of meaning, we gain a clearer view of how societies stabilize themselves, how authority becomes normal, and how questioning emerges only when lived experience outpaces explanation. That tension between experience and narrative remains the engine of historical change, and it is as present now as it was in the Middle Ages. The relationship between experience and narrative deserves careful attention, because it explains not only how medieval conspiracies endured, but why they eventually weakened. In every society, narratives survive only as long as they continue to explain lived reality. When daily experience repeatedly contradicts inherited explanations, even the most deeply embedded systems begin to strain. In medieval Europe, this tension accumulated slowly. For centuries, hardship had been framed as spiritually meaningful. Famine tested faith. Disease purified the soul. Poverty encouraged humility. These explanations functioned because they were consistent with a static world. Social mobility was rare. Life expectancy was short. Change was slow. But as Europe entered periods of accelerated transformation, the old narratives struggled to keep pace. Urbanization altered social relationships. People encountered strangers daily. Traditional community enforcement weakened. Anonymous life reduced the power of reputation and local conformity. Individuals gained limited freedom simply by moving beyond the reach of familiar structures. This anonymity subtly undermined medieval conspiracies. When social pressure weakened, belief required reinforcement. Authority could no longer rely solely on shared assumption. It needed explicit justification. And explicit justification invites scrutiny. Economic change further widened the gap. As commerce expanded, individuals experienced cause and effect relationships that contradicted inherited explanations. Wealth no longer aligned neatly with virtue. Hard work did not guarantee security. Market fluctuations produced suffering without moral logic. The narrative of divinely ordered hierarchy struggled to account for these realities. At the same time, access to information, though still restricted, increased enough to introduce comparison. People learned that customs differed between regions. Laws varied. Religious practices were not uniform. This variability suggested that order was constructed, not universal. Once this realization took root, it could not be undone. The medieval conspiratorial system depended on the assumption that the existing order reflected an eternal design. Variability threatened that assumption. If systems differed, they could be changed. This insight did not immediately produce rebellion. More often, it produced quiet doubt. Doubt is the most destabilizing force for any narrative-based system. Unlike opposition, doubt does not announce itself. It spreads privately, unevenly, and unpredictably. It weakens consensus without triggering immediate response. Medieval conspiracies were particularly vulnerable to doubt because they relied on internalization. Once belief weakened, enforcement required more overt coercion. Overt coercion exposed the system's fragility. This transition can be observed in late medieval and early modern attempts to reassert authority through stricter regulation, harsher punishment, and centralized control. These measures did not signal confidence. They signaled erosion. Authority was compensating for declining belief. Yet, even as medieval conspiracies weakened, they continued to shape emerging systems. The habits formed under centuries of hierarchical belief did not vanish. They were transferred. People accustomed to obedience did not suddenly become autonomous. They sought new sources of legitimacy. Institutions stepped into this role. The result was continuity disguised as change. This is why medieval conspiracies remain relevant. They illustrate that historical transformation often preserves underlying dynamics while altering surface features. Structures endure by adapting to new conditions. Modern audiences sometimes expect historical conspiracies to end with revelation, a moment when truth emerges and deception collapses. Medieval history offers no such climax. There is no final exposure, no collective awakening. There is only gradual replacement. Old explanations fade. New ones arise. Authority shifts language. Control persists. Understanding this pattern reframes how we think about progress. It suggests that enlightenment is not a permanent achievement, but a recurring process. Each generation inherits narratives that feel natural and must rediscover their constructed nature. The medieval world did not fail because it was deceptive. It functioned because it was coherent. It declined when coherence dissolved. This distinction matters. It reminds us that the danger of conspiratorial systems lies not in their falsehood, but in their explanatory power. The more effectively a narrative explains suffering, hierarchy, and uncertainty, the more deeply it embeds itself. Medieval conspiracies succeeded because they answered the most pressing questions of their time. They explained why life was difficult, why inequality existed, and why obedience mattered. When those answers no longer matched experience, the system weakened. Yet the human need for explanation did not disappear. It simply sought new forms. This cycle continues. As listeners reflect on medieval conspiracies, the goal is not to judge the past, but to recognize this recurring dynamic, to see how narratives shape perception, to understand how authority legitimizes itself, to appreciate how control often operates through meaning rather than force. The medieval period offers clarity precisely because of its distance. It allows us to observe patterns without immediate emotional investment. In doing so, it equips us with perspective, not certainty, not solutions, but awareness. And awareness, as history repeatedly demonstrates, is the precondition for meaningful change. Awareness, however, does not immediately dismantle inherited structures. In medieval Europe, even as doubt spread and coherence weakened, daily life continued to operate within familiar frameworks. People still attended church, obeyed local authorities, and performed expected roles. The presence of doubt did not instantly translate into freedom. More often, it produced ambivalence. This ambivalence is a crucial stage in the life cycle of conspiratorial systems. When belief is strong, systems feel natural. When belief collapses entirely, systems face open resistance. But in the long middle phase, where belief erodes without disappearing, systems often become more entrenched. They rely less on conviction and more on routine. Routine, unlike belief, does not require agreement. Medieval conspiracies entered this phase during the late Middle Ages. Practices continued because they were familiar, not because they were convincing. Rituals were performed because they structured time. Hierarchies were observed because they organized labor. Authority persisted because alternatives were unclear. This persistence through habit explains why medieval systems did not collapse suddenly under pressure. Even when explanations faltered, the machinery of daily life continued to operate. Habits are powerful stabilizers. They allow systems to survive ideological decay by embedding themselves in repetition. Over time, actions performed without belief still reinforce structure. Participation sustains form, even as meaning drains away. This dynamic extended into early modern institutions, which inherited not only medieval structures but medieval habits of compliance. People accustomed to hierarchical obedience transferred that obedience to new authorities. Bureaucracies replaced lordship. Law replaced custom. Regulation replaced ritual. Yet the underlying posture toward authority remained largely unchanged. This continuity challenges simplistic narratives of liberation. Historical change often replaces one form of dependence with another. What alters is not submission itself, but its justification. Medieval conspiracies justified obedience through theology. Early modern systems justified it through legality. Later systems would justify it through efficiency, expertise, or security. Each justification reflects the dominant anxieties of its time. The medieval world feared divine disorder. The early modern world feared chaos and instability. Later societies would fear inefficiency, threat, or uncertainty. Authority adapts its language accordingly. Understanding this adaptability is essential to understanding conspiratorial power. Conspiracies, in their most durable form, are not rigid schemes. They are flexible narratives that align with prevailing concerns. They absorb criticism by reframing it. They survive exposure by redefining relevance. Medieval conspiracies exemplify this flexibility. When challenged on moral grounds, they emphasized spiritual necessity. When challenged by lived experience, they adjusted practice without abandoning structure. When challenged by reform, they incorporated reformers into existing institutions. This capacity to incorporate opposition is one of the most effective mechanisms of control. By allowing limited critique, systems diffuse pressure while preserving legitimacy. Critics become participants. Reform becomes validation. This pattern repeats across history. It is visible in the medieval church's response to internal criticism. It is visible in monarchies granting charters. It is visible in later institutions embracing transparency rhetoric while maintaining opacity. The medieval period teaches us that conspiratorial systems are not defeated by confrontation alone. They are weakened when their narratives fail to explain reality, and when alternatives become imaginable. Imagination, therefore, is central. Medieval conspiracies constrained imagination by defining what was thinkable. As long as hierarchy, obedience, and suffering were framed as sacred or natural, alternatives remained inconceivable. When language expanded, when people could name injustice, contingency, and choice, the system's grip loosened. This expansion did not require universal literacy or philosophical sophistication. It required only comparison, the realization that things could be otherwise. Once that realization appears, it cannot be entirely suppressed. Yet even then, change remains slow. People rarely abandon familiar systems without assurance that alternatives will provide stability. Medieval conspiracies persisted in part because they offered predictability in an unpredictable world. They made sense of suffering, even if that sense was costly. The tension between predictability and freedom remains unresolved in human societies. Every system of authority must navigate it. Medieval conspiracies prioritized predictability. They accepted inequality and suffering as the price of order. Later systems would promise improvement while retaining control. Neither approach eliminates the tension. They manage it differently. As this documentary continues to unfold, one theme remains consistent. Medieval conspiracies were not aberrations. They were expressions of a fundamental human challenge: how to organize meaning, authority, and survival in a complex world. They reveal how deeply narrative shapes behavior, how power embeds itself in explanation, and how difficult it is to distinguish necessity from construction once a system becomes normalized. This recognition does not demand cynicism. It invites discernment. History, when approached slowly and carefully, does not tell us what to think. It shows us patterns. It offers distance. It allows reflection without urgency. In studying medieval conspiracies, we are not uncovering hidden villains. We are observing the quiet mechanics of order. And in doing so, we gain the ability to notice those mechanics wherever they appear. Noticing the mechanics of order is a skill that develops slowly. Medieval societies did not suddenly awaken to the constructed nature of their world, just as modern societies do not abruptly recognize their own assumptions. Instead, awareness accumulates unevenly, often among small groups first, before diffusing gradually through culture. In medieval Europe, this uneven awareness created fractures rather than revolutions. Certain individuals, merchants, scholars, administrators, travelers, encountered multiple systems of authority and belief. They saw firsthand that laws differed between cities, that religious practices varied, that customs were not universal. This exposure did not immediately liberate them from existing frameworks, but it weakened the idea that any single framework was absolute. The power of medieval conspiracies depended heavily on isolation. When communities were inward-facing and self-contained, shared narratives remained stable. As contact increased, comparison became unavoidable. Comparison is corrosive to inevitability. Once people observe that different systems produce different outcomes, the claim that one order is divinely or naturally fixed loses credibility. It may persist rhetorically, but it no longer commands unquestioned acceptance. Yet even then, most people did not reject authority outright. They recalibrated their relationship to it. Obedience became conditional rather than absolute. Loyalty became pragmatic rather than sacred. Authority was respected when it functioned effectively and criticized when it failed. This shift marks a critical transformation in the nature of conspiratorial systems. When authority is sacred, it cannot admit failure without undermining itself. When authority is functional, it can tolerate limited criticism as long as performance continues. Early modern institutions increasingly adopted this latter posture. The medieval world thus contributed not only conspiratorial structures, but strategies for managing their decline. Institutions learned to survive skepticism by lowering expectations. They no longer promised divine justice. They promised relative order. They no longer claimed perfection. They claimed necessity. This recalibration made authority more resilient. People might distrust institutions, but they continued to depend on them. Distrust without alternatives does not produce collapse. It produces accommodation. Accommodation is another form of stability. Medieval conspiracies illustrate how deeply this pattern runs. Even when belief eroded, dependence remained. People continued to rely on the church for rituals, on lords for protection, on courts for dispute resolution. These dependencies anchored authority long after its narratives weakened. This dynamic complicates the idea of exposure as a solution to conspiratorial systems. Revealing inconsistencies does not automatically dismantle power. As long as institutions provide essential functions, they retain leverage. Medieval conspiracies survived countless contradictions because they were embedded in survival itself. The question was never simply whether people believed. It was whether they could live without the system. For most of medieval history, the answer was no. This reality tempers modern interpretations that frame medieval people as trapped by ignorance alone. They were constrained by infrastructure, by interdependence, by limited alternatives. Belief reinforced these constraints, but it did not create them entirely. Power operates most effectively when belief and necessity align. This alignment is not unique to the medieval period. What medieval conspiracies offer is a clear, distilled example of how authority consolidates itself by intertwining explanation with function. The system does not merely tell people why things are the way they are. It organizes life so that alternatives are impractical. Over time, this impracticality becomes internalized as impossibility. The medieval world shows us how that internalization happens. It begins with explanation. Continues with repetition. It is sustained by habit, and it endures through dependence. Breaking such a system requires more than awareness. It requires structural change, new forms of organization that make alternatives viable. This is why medieval conspiracies dissolved slowly. Structural transformation lagged behind intellectual change. New economic forms, new political arrangements, and new modes of knowledge had to develop before old narratives could be fully abandoned. History rarely moves at the speed of thought. It moves at the speed of infrastructure. This insight is perhaps one of the most valuable lessons the medieval period offers. It reminds us that ideas alone do not reshape societies. They must be supported by material conditions, social networks, and institutional alternatives. Without these, awareness remains abstract. Medieval conspiracies endured because they were supported by the totality of medieval life. Land ownership, food production, legal authority, spiritual practice, all reinforced one another. To challenge one element was to confront the entire structure. Most people chose adaptation over confrontation. This choice was not cowardice. It was rational survival. Recognizing this allows us to approach medieval history with greater nuance. It allows us to see conspiratorial systems not as sinister designs, but as emergent properties of complex societies seeking stability. It also cautions us against assuming that modern systems are fundamentally different. The mechanisms change, the language evolves, but the relationship between authority, narrative, and dependence remains. As we continue this documentary, the medieval world becomes less distant and more instructive. It shows us how systems persist even when belief weakens, how power adapts to skepticism, and how control often survives exposure by embedding itself in necessity. These patterns do not belong to the past. They belong to history, and history, as the medieval period reminds us, is never truly over. The realization that history moves at the speed of infrastructure rather than ideas reframes how we understand both medieval conspiracies and their long afterlife. Ideas can emerge quickly. Insight can spread unevenly but rapidly. Structures, however, change slowly, constrained by material realities and human dependence. This imbalance explains why awareness so often coexists with compliance. In medieval Europe, infrastructure was deeply intertwined with authority. Land ownership determined food production. Protection depended on feudal obligation. Spiritual life was organized through the church's calendar, rituals, and sacraments. Legal disputes passed through institutions tied to the same hierarchy. To withdraw from authority was not merely an ideological act. It was a practical risk. This interdependence meant that medieval conspiracies did not need to be enforced constantly. They were sustained by everyday necessity. People participated because participation ensured survival. Over time, this participation created emotional investment. Systems that provide stability even at high cost become psychologically defended. Criticism threatens not only authority, but the fragile equilibrium people rely on. This defense mechanism explains why medieval conspiracies often provoked hostility toward dissenters rather than toward institutions. Those who questioned shared narratives were perceived as destabilizing forces. They endangered communal survival by undermining coherence. Social pressure thus became a form of enforcement. Communities policed themselves. Deviance attracted suspicion. Conformity ensured safety. These dynamics allowed institutional authority to remain relatively distant while still exerting profound control. The conspiratorial aspect of this arrangement lies in its invisibility. There was no single center coordinating suppression. Control emerged organically through aligned incentives. Each participant reinforced the system because the system appeared to protect them. This alignment between individual interest and institutional stability is one of the most powerful features of enduring authority. It also complicates the notion of blame. Medieval conspiracies were not sustained solely by elites manipulating the masses. They were sustained by collective participation in a system that made sense within its context. Elites benefited disproportionately, but they also operated within inherited frameworks. Power, in this sense, was distributed as much as it was concentrated. This distribution allowed responsibility to diffuse. No single actor needed to justify the whole. Each justified their role as necessary, traditional, or unavoidable. Such diffusion is a hallmark of durable conspiratorial systems. As the medieval world gave way to early modern arrangements, this diffusion persisted. Authority became more bureaucratic, but not necessarily more accountable. Decision-making spread across offices, procedures, and rules. Responsibility became harder to locate. This transformation did not eliminate conspiratorial dynamics. It refined them. Instead of belief-based obedience, systems relied on procedural compliance. Instead of spiritual sanction, they relied on legality. Instead of ritual, they relied on routine. Each shift reduced emotional intensity while increasing stability. Medieval conspiracies, by contrast, were emotionally vivid. Fear of damnation, hope of salvation, and reverence for hierarchy created strong, effective bonds. As these bonds weakened, authority compensated by embedding itself more deeply into material life. The lesson is subtle but important. When emotional commitment fades, structural dependence increases. Modern observers often assume that reduced belief equates to increased freedom. Medieval history suggests otherwise. Skepticism alone does not dismantle power. It may simply change how power operates. The late medieval period illustrates this clearly. As theological certainty weakened, institutions became more pragmatic, more administrative, and more entrenched. Authority lost its sacred aura but gained operational resilience. This resilience ensured continuity. The medieval conspiratorial system did not collapse under doubt. It transitioned. Understanding this transition helps explain why medieval conspiracies remain relevant. They represent an early stage in a long process of institutional adaptation. They reveal how authority learns to survive changing conditions. They also remind us that control is rarely total or absolute. Medieval people navigated their world with agency, creativity, and negotiation. They found spaces of autonomy within constraints. They adapted practices to local needs. They resisted quietly where open resistance was impossible. This complexity resists simple narratives of domination. Conspiratorial systems coexist with human improvisation. People bend rules, reinterpret narratives, and exploit gaps. These micro-adjustments do not overthrow systems, but they shape how systems are experienced. Medieval conspiracies were therefore lived unevenly. Their impact varied by region, status, and circumstance. Some experienced them as oppressive. Others experienced them as protective. Most experienced them as background. This variability is another reason such systems endure. Uniform oppression invites unified resistance. Uneven impact fragments response. Authority, intentionally or not, benefits from this fragmentation. As this documentary continues its slow examination, the medieval world emerges not as a monolith, but as a dynamic environment where power, belief, and necessity interacted constantly. Conspiracies were not static impositions. They were evolving patterns shaped by context. Recognizing this prevents us from oversimplifying the past and from misunderstanding the present. The medieval period does not teach us to distrust institutions reflexively. It teaches us to observe how institutions justify themselves, how narratives normalize power, and how dependence shapes perception. These lessons remain quietly relevant. They do not demand alarm. They invite attention, and attention, sustained over time, is the foundation of historical understanding. Attention, sustained and unhurried, allows patterns to emerge that are otherwise easy to miss. Medieval conspiracies become clearer not when examined as isolated phenomena, but when placed within the long arc of institutional survival. What we see again and again is that authority rarely relies on a single source of legitimacy. Instead, it layers justifications so that when one weakens, others remain. In medieval Europe, religion was the primary layer. Beneath it sat custom, kinship, and economic dependence. When religious certainty began to erode, custom and necessity continued to bind people to the system. Later, law and administration would be added as additional layers. This redundancy made authority resilient. Conspiratorial systems thrive when they do not depend on any single belief. They endure by offering multiple reasons to comply, so that doubt in one area does not lead to disengagement entirely. For example, a peasant might privately doubt the moral authority of a local lord, yet continue to work the land because survival required it. A merchant might question church doctrine, yet participate in religious rituals because social standing depended on conformity. A scholar might recognize contradictions in official narratives, yet avoid open challenge because career advancement required discretion. Each compromise reinforced the system. Medieval conspiracies did not require universal belief. They required sufficient alignment between belief, habit, and interest. This alignment explains why exposure alone rarely produces change. Even when contradictions are visible, participation often continues because alternatives appear riskier than compliance. Over time, this calculation becomes automatic. People no longer experience it as a choice. Choice fades into routine. Routine is one of the least examined, yet most powerful elements of historical continuity. It bridges generations. It transmits norms without explicit instruction. It normalizes structures long after their original justification has faded. Medieval routines, agricultural cycles, religious calendars, legal procedures structured time itself. They shaped how people experienced days, seasons, and years. Authority embedded itself in these rhythms, becoming inseparable from the passage of life. When authority is woven into time, resistance becomes disruptive not only socially, but existentially. To break with routine is to break with identity. This helps explain why medieval conspiracies were so difficult to dismantle. They were not merely beliefs about the world. They were ways of living within it. As centuries passed, new routines replaced old ones. Religious calendars gave way, in part, to bureaucratic schedules. Feudal obligations gave way to wage labor. Oral custom gave way to written regulation. Yet the underlying dynamic remained. Authority organized time, labor, and expectation. Each new arrangement claimed to be more rational, more efficient, more humane. And in many ways it was. But it also preserved the fundamental asymmetry between those who design systems and those who live within them. Medieval conspiracies are therefore best understood as early manifestations of a broader historical process. The institutionalization of meaning. Institutions do not merely manage resources or enforce rules. They produce explanations. They define what is normal, what is possible, and what is necessary. Over time, these definitions become invisible. When people say, "This is just how things are," they echo medieval assumptions without realizing it. This continuity does not imply that history is static or futile. Change occurs. Conditions improve. Freedoms expand. But change operates within inherited structures. It is negotiated rather than absolute. Medieval conspiracies remind us that progress is layered. New freedoms coexist with old constraints. New narratives replace old ones, but the need for narrative itself remains. This need is deeply human. In uncertain environments, explanations provide comfort. They reduce anxiety. They offer a sense of order. Medieval conspiracies succeeded because they met these needs effectively. They provided meaning in the face of hardship and uncertainty. When modern audiences encounter medieval conspiracies, they often focus on the obvious falsehoods. What they miss is the functional truth these systems offered, a way to live in a world that felt comprehensible. This functional truth made them persuasive. Understanding this does not require agreement with medieval beliefs. It requires empathy for the conditions that made those beliefs viable. It also requires humility about our own systems. Every era believes its explanations are more rational than those of the past. Medieval Europe believed its theological framework was self-evident. Later periods believed legal rationality was superior. Modern societies often believe technical expertise provides neutrality. History suggests caution. Each framework solves certain problems while creating others. Each conceals power in different ways. Each produces its own blind spots. Medieval conspiracies are instructive because they expose these blind spots with clarity. Their religious language makes their assumptions visible. Their hierarchies are explicit. Their justifications are articulated openly. This openness allows us to study mechanisms that are harder to detect in more abstract systems. By slowing down and examining these mechanisms, we gain more than historical knowledge. We gain perspective on how authority shapes perception, how narratives normalize inequality, and how systems persist through adaptation rather than deception. The medieval world, in this sense, is not distant. It is foundational. Conspiracies are not relics. They are early chapters in an ongoing story about how human societies organize power and meaning. And that story, as history continually reminds us, is still being written. If medieval conspiracies are early chapters in a longer story, then that story is ultimately about normalization. Power does not merely seek obedience, it seeks familiarity. The moment authority becomes familiar, it ceases to feel imposed. It becomes environment. In medieval Europe, this environmental quality of power was achieved through repetition across generations. Children did not learn hierarchy as a concept. They absorbed it as atmosphere. The structure of family, labor, worship, and law all reinforced the same assumptions. Authority was not encountered as an external force, but as the background condition of life. This background quality is what makes conspiratorial systems so difficult to recognize from within. When power operates as environment, questioning it feels less like inquiry and more like disorientation. The system does not need to punish dissent aggressively. Confusion alone is enough to deter it. Medieval conspiracies thrived because they reduced uncertainty, even when they imposed constraint. This reduction of uncertainty was not trivial. Medieval life was precarious. Famine, disease, and violence were constant threats. In such conditions, a stable explanatory framework had immense value. It told people what to expect, how to behave, and where responsibility lay. The cost of that stability was submission. Yet from within the medieval world, this cost did not always appear unreasonable. Submission promised order. Order promised survival. Survival promised continuity. The conspiratorial aspect lies not in deception, but in the way this trade-off was framed as natural rather than chosen. Over time, the framing hardened. What began as pragmatic adaptation became moral obligation. Obedience was no longer merely useful, it was virtuous. Questioning authority was no longer merely risky, it was wrong. This moralization of structure is a key feature of medieval conspiracies. By embedding power in morality, institutions protected themselves from practical critique. If authority was challenged, the challenge could be dismissed as sinful, selfish, or dangerous. Structural questions were reframed as character flaws. This reframing redirected attention away from systems and toward individuals. It also preserved the legitimacy of the system even when outcomes were clearly harmful. Medieval history provides countless examples of suffering justified through moral narratives. Poverty was framed as humility. Plague was framed as divine correction. Inequality was framed as order. Each explanation preserved the system by shifting blame away from structure. These narratives were not necessarily invented cynically. They reflected genuine attempts to make sense of hardship. But their effect was to stabilize authority regardless of intent. Intent, in fact, is often irrelevant to the functioning of conspiratorial systems. What matters is alignment between explanation and outcome, between belief and behavior, between necessity and justification. When these align, systems endure. Medieval conspiracies endured because alignment was maintained across multiple domains of life. As alignment weakened in one area, it was reinforced in another. When religious authority faltered, legal authority expanded. When moral certainty declined, administrative order increased. When belief weakened, habit compensated. This compensatory dynamic is essential to understanding continuity. No system relies on a single pillar. It relies on networks of support. When one support weakens, others absorb the strain. Medieval Europe illustrates this with clarity. Its conspiracies were not monolithic. They were layered, interconnected, and adaptive. This adaptability explains why medieval authority did not collapse under contradiction. It explains why reform often strengthened institutions rather than dismantling them. It explains why exposure rarely produced transformation on its own. Transformation required misalignment across multiple domains simultaneously. Such moments were rare. When they did occur during prolonged crises, demographic collapse, or structural economic change, authority shifted but did not vanish. New systems emerged that carried forward many old assumptions. Hierarchy persisted, inequality persisted, narrative control persisted. The medieval period, therefore, is not an isolated era of control overcome by modern freedom. It is part of a continuum in which power repeatedly reorganizes itself to meet changing conditions. Understanding medieval conspiracies allows us to trace this continuum with greater precision. It shows us that authority is not sustained primarily by lies, but by coherence. Systems survive when they offer explanations that feel sufficient, even if those explanations obscure deeper causes. This insight challenges simplistic notions of enlightenment. Knowledge alone does not dissolve power. Understanding does not automatically lead to liberation. Systems are dismantled not when they are revealed, but when they no longer function, when they fail to provide stability, meaning, or coordination. Even then, what replaces them often inherits their form. This is not pessimism. It is realism. History does not move toward perfection. It moves through adaptation. Medieval conspiracies remind us that adaptation often preserves structure while altering language. Authority learns. It refines its narratives. It becomes less visible, more procedural, more abstract. Visibility is not its goal. Stability is. As listeners reflect on this, the medieval world becomes less exotic and more instructive. Its conspiracies are not relics of superstition, but early experiments in large-scale social organization. They show how meaning, power, and survival intertwine. They also reveal why dismantling unjust systems is so difficult. It requires more than critique. It requires replacement. New forms of order must emerge that can meet human needs without reproducing the same asymmetries. History offers no guarantee that this will happen, but it offers understanding. And understanding, sustained and patient, is the quiet foundation upon which meaningful change becomes possible. Meaningful change, when it arrives, rarely announces itself as such. In medieval Europe, change was often indistinguishable from continuity while it was happening. People adapted to new conditions using old language. New practices were justified through familiar concepts. The world shifted, but it did so quietly, beneath the surface of tradition. This quiet transformation is one of the most revealing aspects of medieval conspiracies. Because authority was embedded in daily life, any alteration to that life had to be framed as preservation rather than rupture. Innovations were presented as restorations of ancient order. Reforms were justified as returns to purity. Even radical changes were cloaked in continuity. This rhetorical strategy preserved legitimacy. By presenting change as continuity, institutions avoided confronting the constructed nature of their authority. They reinforced the idea that the system was timeless, even as it evolved. This pattern persists across history. Medieval conspiracies did not depend on freezing society in place. They depended on managing change without allowing it to destabilize foundational assumptions. As long as hierarchy, obedience, and narrative authority remained intact, specific practices could evolve. This flexibility is one reason medieval systems lasted so long. Rigid systems break. Adaptive systems endure. Adaptation, however, comes at a cost. Over time, the distance between narrative and reality grows. Explanations become less convincing. Justifications become more technical, more abstract, more defensive. Authority increasingly relies on procedure rather than persuasion. The late medieval period exhibits this shift clearly. As religious explanations lost their emotional grip, institutions leaned more heavily on regulation, documentation, and enforcement. Authority became less inspiring and more administrative. This change altered how people experienced power. Where medieval obedience had once been infused with meaning, it increasingly felt transactional. Compliance was exchanged for stability. Participation was pragmatic rather than devotional. This pragmatic obedience is more durable than belief-based obedience, but it is also more brittle. It holds as long as systems function. When they fail, loyalty evaporates quickly. Medieval conspiracies thus sowed the seeds of their own transformation. By embedding authority deeply into infrastructure, they ensured survival beyond belief. But by doing so, they also exposed themselves to disruption when infrastructure changed. Economic shifts, demographic pressures, and technological developments gradually undermined the conditions that made medieval systems viable. As new forms of organization emerged, old narratives struggled to adapt. Yet even then, the transition was gradual. People did not abandon medieval assumptions overnight. They layered new understandings atop old ones. Religious explanations coexisted with practical reasoning. Hierarchical loyalty coexisted with contractual relationships. Tradition coexisted with innovation. This layering created ambiguity. Ambiguity weakens conspiratorial systems by reducing coherence. When multiple explanations compete, none can fully dominate. Authority becomes negotiable rather than absolute. Negotiability marks a turning point. Once authority must justify itself repeatedly, it loses the invisibility that made it powerful. Justification invites evaluation. Evaluation invites comparison. Comparison invites choice. Choice, however limited, alters the relationship between individuals and systems. Medieval conspiracies depended on the absence of choice, not because alternatives were actively suppressed, but because they were structurally unavailable. As alternatives became imaginable and, eventually, practical, the system's grip loosened. This process was uneven and incomplete. Some regions changed faster than others. Some social groups gained autonomy earlier. Many remained bound by old structures long after their justifications had faded. History does not move uniformly, but the direction of change was clear. Authority shifted from being inherited to being administered, from being sacred to being functional, from being unquestioned to being conditional. Each shift reduced the emotional intensity of obedience while preserving its necessity. This transformation did not eliminate conspiratorial dynamics. It refined them. Modern systems would inherit medieval habits of compliance, but would disguise them under new languages: efficiency, progress, rationality. Control would persist, but it would feel less personal, less moralized, less visible. In this sense, medieval conspiracies are not cautionary tales of ignorance. They are foundational case studies in institutional evolution. They show how power learns from experience, how it adapts to resistance, how it survives skepticism by embedding itself deeper into everyday life. They also show how difficult it is to step outside inherited frameworks. People do not simply choose freedom when it becomes available. Freedom introduces uncertainty. It requires new forms of coordination, new sources of meaning, new narratives to replace old ones. Medieval conspiracies provided meaning cheaply. They explained suffering, justified inequality, and promised order. Replacing them required alternatives that could do the same. This requirement slowed transformation. As listeners absorb this history, the medieval world begins to feel less alien. Its conspiracies resemble familiar patterns. Its authority echoes modern structures. Its struggles reflect enduring human dilemmas. How much order is necessary? How much inequality is tolerable? How much uncertainty can societies endure? Medieval Europe answered these questions in ways shaped by its conditions. Later societies would answer differently, but never definitively. History does not resolve these tensions. It manages them, and in managing them, it produces systems that feel natural, inevitable, and unquestionable until they no longer do. The medieval period reminds us that such moments of questioning are rare, fragile, and contingent. They depend not only on ideas, but on conditions. Understanding this allows us to approach both past and present with patience rather than certainty. It encourages observation over judgment, and it affirms the value of slow, reflective history, not as entertainment, but as orientation. Orientation is perhaps the most understated function of historical understanding. Medieval conspiracies did not simply organize power. They oriented people within the world. They told individuals where they stood, what was expected of them, and how to interpret misfortune or success. In doing so, they reduced existential uncertainty. This orienting function is often overlooked because it operates quietly. In medieval Europe, a person's place in society was largely fixed at birth. This fixity limited opportunity, but it also simplified expectation. One did not need to imagine multiple futures or navigate constant choice. The system, however constraining, provided clarity. Clarity is psychologically stabilizing. Medieval conspiracies endured in part because they offered this clarity. They framed life as a sequence of duties aligned with cosmic order. Even suffering was intelligible. Even injustice could be rationalized. The system did not promise fairness. It promised meaning. When modern observers evaluate medieval authority solely through the lens of freedom, they miss this trade-off. Medieval people were not choosing between liberty and oppression as abstract concepts. They were choosing between coherence and uncertainty. Given the material conditions of the time, coherence often felt preferable. As conditions changed, however, coherence became harder to maintain. Economic complexity, social mobility, and intellectual exchange introduced ambiguity. People encountered situations the old narratives could not easily explain. Ambiguity is destabilizing. When narratives fail to orient experience, anxiety increases. People search for new explanations, but those explanations must compete with deeply ingrained habits. The result is often tension rather than replacement. This tension characterized the late medieval and early modern periods. Old frameworks persisted but no longer satisfied completely. New frameworks emerged but lacked legitimacy. Authority hovered between sacred certainty and pragmatic necessity. This in-between state is fertile ground for new conspiratorial dynamics. When no single narrative dominates, suspicion grows. People sense that explanations are partial or selective. Trust weakens. Institutions respond by emphasizing order, procedure, and control. Transparency is promised, but complexity increases. Medieval conspiracies thus give way to early modern anxieties. Yet the underlying pattern remains. Authority seeks to reorient experience. It must provide a narrative that reduces uncertainty enough to sustain participation. Without orientation, systems fragment. The medieval period teaches us that orientation is not achieved through truth alone. It is achieved through coherence, repetition, and social reinforcement. Narratives succeed when they align with lived experience sufficiently to feel plausible. This insight helps explain why conspiratorial systems often persist even after their factual claims are challenged. They continue to orient behavior. They continue to organize expectation. People may doubt explanations intellectually while relying on them practically. This duality, skepticism paired with dependence, is a recurring feature of historical transition. Medieval Europe experienced it acutely, so have many societies since. Understanding this duality allows us to move beyond simplistic explanations of control. It reveals why exposure does not automatically lead to disengagement. It shows why institutions can survive loss of trust. Trust is only one component of stability. Habit, dependence, and orientation matter just as much. Medieval conspiracies were effective because they integrated all three. They were believed, lived, and relied upon. As belief weakened, the others compensated. This compensation delayed transformation. When transformation finally occurred, it did not erase the past. It reorganized it. New institutions inherited old habits. New narratives repurposed old assumptions. Authority persisted through continuity disguised as change. The medieval world thus functions as a case study in how societies manage the tension between stability and adaptation. It shows that conspiratorial systems are not aberrations. They are responses to fundamental human needs. The need for order, meaning, and predictability. The danger arises when these needs are met in ways that obscure alternatives and normalize inequality. But even then, the system's appeal cannot be dismissed as mere manipulation. It is grounded in genuine human concern. This recognition complicates moral judgment, but it deepens understanding. As listeners reflect on medieval conspiracies in this light, the narrative shifts. The focus moves away from secret plots and toward structural patterns. It becomes clear that the most influential conspiracies are those that shape perception rather than hide information. They do not rely on secrecy, they rely on normalization. Medieval Europe normalized hierarchy, obedience, and suffering through shared narratives that aligned with material reality. When reality changed, normalization faltered. But it did not vanish. Instead, it migrated. Modern societies normalize different assumptions. They emphasize mobility, choice, and rationality. Yet they also normalize dependence on systems that are complex, opaque, and difficult to challenge. The medieval period helps us see this continuity. It reminds us that every era constructs explanations that feel self-evident. These explanations organize life until they no longer do. At that point, transition begins, slowly, unevenly, and without clear endpoints. History, viewed this way, is not a march toward truth. It is a series of reorientations. Medieval conspiracies were one such orientation. They offered coherence in a world of scarcity and risk. They justified authority in a way that aligned with survival. They shaped perception so thoroughly that alternatives were unimaginable. When those conditions changed, the orientation shifted. New conspiracies emerged, less religious, more administrative, less visible. The medieval period, therefore, does not simply belong to the past. It illuminates the mechanisms by which societies adapt explanations to conditions. By studying it patiently without sensationalism, we gain a clearer view of how power operates across time, not as a hidden enemy, but as a familiar structure, one that feels natural, one that feels necessary, until it doesn't. That moment when what once felt necessary begins to feel negotiable is among the most delicate phases in any society's history. Medieval Europe experienced this transition not as a single rupture, but as a prolonged period of uncertainty, during which old explanations lingered even as their authority weakened. What makes this phase particularly revealing is that power does not disappear when necessity is questioned. It reorganizes. As medieval conspiracies lost their absolute grip, institutions adjusted by narrowing their claims. Authority no longer needed to explain the entire universe. It needed only to manage specific domains: land, law, taxation, ritual. Total explanation gave way to partial justification. This reduction made authority more defensible. By limiting its scope, power reduced the risk of total collapse. Failures could be contained. Contradictions could be localized. The system no longer stood or fell on a single narrative. This modularization of authority marks a significant evolution. Medieval conspiracies had been comprehensive. They explained everything from cosmic order to daily labor. Early modern systems became specialized. Different institutions governed different aspects of life, each with its own logic and justification. Specialization diffused resistance. When authority is unified, opposition can focus. When authority is fragmented, opposition fragments with it. Complaints are redirected. Responsibility is dispersed. Coordination becomes difficult. Medieval Europe transitioned into this fragmented arrangement gradually. Ecclesiastical courts handled spiritual matters. Royal courts handled secular disputes. Guilds regulated trades. Town councils managed local affairs. Each institution claimed limited authority, but together they covered nearly every aspect of life. This diffusion made power harder to confront as a whole. People might resent one institution while relying on another. They might distrust officials but respect procedures. They might criticize corruption while accepting hierarchy. Such compartmentalization stabilizes systems even amid widespread dissatisfaction. The conspiratorial aspect here is structural rather than intentional. No single institution needs to deceive. The system functions because each part appears reasonable within its domain. The overall effect, comprehensive control, emerges without central coordination. Medieval conspiracies thus teach us that control can arise from alignment rather than conspiracy in the narrow sense. This realization challenges popular conceptions of conspiracy as secret plotting. It suggests that the most enduring forms of control are emergent properties of social organization, not deliberate schemes. They arise when incentives align. Institutions seek stability. Individuals seek security. Narratives emerge that reconcile the two. Over time, these narratives harden into assumptions. Assumptions are rarely questioned. They operate beneath awareness. They shape perception silently. They define what feels realistic and what feels absurd. In medieval Europe, assumptions about hierarchy, obedience, and divine order shaped every aspect of life. As those assumptions weakened, new ones took their place. They were less theological, more procedural, but equally powerful. The shift from sacred to administrative authority did not reduce control. It changed its texture. Administrative authority feels less personal. It appears neutral. It presents decisions as outcomes of process rather than intention. This presentation reduces emotional resistance. It discourages moral critique by reframing issues as technical. Technical language obscures power. Medieval conspiracies relied on moral language. Sin, virtue, obedience, and salvation were explicit. Early modern systems relied increasingly on legal and economic language. Rights, obligations, efficiency, and necessity replaced spiritual categories. Each language serves the same function: to render authority intelligible and acceptable. Understanding this continuity dissolves the illusion that medieval conspiracies were uniquely oppressive or irrational. They were consistent with their context. Later systems are consistent with theirs. History does not progress by abandoning control. Progresses by reinventing it. This reinvention often feels like liberation because it removes the most visible constraints. Yet, invisible constraints can be equally binding. Medieval Europe shows us the importance of visibility. Because medieval conspiracies were explicit, they are easier to analyze. Their assumptions are articulated. Their hierarchies are visible. Their justifications are recorded. Modern systems, by contrast, often operate through abstraction. They hide power in procedures, algorithms, and institutions that appear impersonal. This makes them harder to perceive, not necessarily more just. The medieval period thus offers a kind of clarity. It allows us to observe mechanisms that later become more subtle. It provides a baseline against which to compare later forms of authority. This is why medieval conspiracies continue to fascinate Tier 1 audiences. They are distant enough to examine without defensiveness, yet close enough to feel relevant. They allow reflection without immediate implication. They also reward slow attention. In long-form listening, patterns emerge that short analysis misses. Repetition becomes meaningful. Continuity becomes visible. The medieval world unfolds not as a collection of events, but as a system. And systems, once seen, cannot be unseen. The purpose of this documentary is not to persuade or provoke. It is to cultivate this kind of seeing, to allow listeners to inhabit a different temporal perspective, where centuries pass slowly and structures reveal themselves. In that slow passage, medieval conspiracies become less sensational and more instructive. They show us how authority normalizes itself, how narratives stabilize societies, how dependence shapes belief, and how change, when it comes, is gradual, negotiated, and incomplete. As we continue, the medieval world recedes further into the background, not because it is irrelevant, but because its lessons have been absorbed into the broader flow of history. What remains is understanding, and understanding, unlike belief, does not demand obedience. It invites reflection, that moment when what once felt necessary begins to feel negotiable is among the most delicate phases in any society's history. Medieval Europe experienced this transition not as a single rupture, but as a prolonged period of uncertainty, during which old explanations lingered even as their authority weakened. What makes this phase particularly revealing is that power does not disappear when necessity is questioned. It reorganizes. As medieval conspiracies lost their absolute grip, institutions adjusted by narrowing their claims. Authority no longer needed to explain the entire universe. It needed only to manage specific domains: land, law, taxation, ritual. Total explanation gave way to partial justification. This reduction made authority more defensible. By limiting its scope, power reduced the risk of total collapse. Failures could be contained. Contradictions could be localized. The system no longer stood or fell on a single narrative. This modularization of authority marks a significant evolution. Medieval conspiracies had been comprehensive. They explained everything from cosmic order to daily labor. Early modern systems became specialized. Different institutions governed different aspects of life, each with its own logic and justification. Specialization diffused resistance. When authority is unified, opposition can focus. When authority is fragmented, opposition fragments with it. Complaints are redirected. Responsibility is dispersed. Coordination becomes difficult. Medieval Europe transitioned into this fragmented arrangement gradually. Ecclesiastical courts handled spiritual matters. Royal courts handled secular disputes. Guilds regulated trades. Town councils managed local affairs. Each institution claimed limited authority, but together they covered nearly every aspect of life. This diffusion made power harder to confront as a whole. People might resent one institution while relying on another. They might distrust officials but respect procedures. They might criticize corruption while accepting hierarchy. Such compartmentalization stabilizes systems even amid widespread dissatisfaction. The conspiratorial aspect here is structural rather than intentional. No single institution needs to deceive. The system functions because each part appears reasonable within its domain. The overall effect, comprehensive control, emerges without central coordination. Medieval conspiracies thus teach us that control can arise from alignment rather than conspiracy in the narrow sense. This realization challenges popular conceptions of conspiracy as secret plotting. It suggests that the most enduring forms of control are emergent properties of social organization, not deliberate schemes. They arise when incentives align. Institutions seek stability. Individuals seek security. Narratives emerge that reconcile the two. Over time, these narratives harden into assumptions. Assumptions are rarely questioned. They operate beneath awareness. They shape perception silently. They define what feels realistic and what feels absurd. In medieval Europe, assumptions about hierarchy, obedience, and divine order shaped every aspect of life. As those assumptions weakened, new ones took their place. They were less theological, more procedural, but equally powerful. The shift from sacred to administrative authority did not reduce control. It changed its texture. Administrative authority feels less personal. It appears neutral. It presents decisions as outcomes of process rather than intention. This presentation reduces emotional resistance. It discourages moral critique by reframing issues as technical. Technical language obscures power. Medieval conspiracies relied on moral language. Sin, virtue, obedience, and salvation were explicit. Early modern systems relied increasingly on legal and economic language. Rights, obligations, efficiency, and necessity replaced spiritual categories. Each language serves the same function: to render authority intelligible and acceptable. Understanding this continuity dissolves the illusion that medieval conspiracies were uniquely oppressive or irrational. They were consistent with their context. Later systems are consistent with theirs. History does not progress by abandoning control. Progresses by reinventing it. This reinvention often feels like liberation because it removes the most visible constraints. Yet, invisible constraints can be equally binding. Medieval Europe shows us the importance of visibility. Because medieval conspiracies were explicit, they are easier to analyze. Their assumptions are articulated. Their hierarchies are visible. Their justifications are recorded. Modern systems, by contrast, often operate through abstraction. They hide power in procedures, algorithms, and institutions that appear impersonal. This makes them harder to perceive, not necessarily more just. The medieval period thus offers a kind of clarity. It allows us to observe mechanisms that later become more subtle. It provides a baseline against which to compare later forms of authority. This is why medieval conspiracies continue to fascinate Tier 1 audiences. They are distant enough to examine without defensiveness, yet close enough to feel relevant. They allow reflection without immediate implication. They also reward slow attention. In long-form listening, patterns emerge that short analysis misses. Repetition becomes meaningful. Continuity becomes visible. The medieval world unfolds not as a collection of events, but as a system. And systems, once seen, cannot be unseen. The purpose of this documentary is not to persuade or provoke. It is to cultivate this kind of seeing, to allow listeners to inhabit a different temporal perspective, where centuries pass slowly and structures reveal themselves. In that slow passage, medieval conspiracies become less sensational and more instructive. They show us how authority normalizes itself, how narratives stabilize societies, how dependence shapes belief, and how change, when it comes, is gradual, negotiated, and incomplete. As we continue, the medieval world recedes further into the background, not because it is irrelevant, but because its lessons have been absorbed into the broader flow of history. What remains is understanding, and understanding, unlike belief, does not demand obedience. It invites reflection. Reflection, when sustained, begins to dissolve the illusion that any system of authority is permanent. Medieval conspiracies felt eternal to those who lived within them, yet from a distance they appear provisional, contingent, and deeply shaped by circumstance. This realization does not diminish their power. It explains it. Power persists not because it is immutable, but because it adapts faster than perception. In medieval Europe, authority adapted by embedding itself into every domain of life. It did not merely govern behavior. It structured time, defined morality, and organized memory. Festivals marked religious calendars. Laws codified social relations. Stories reinforced hierarchy. Each element reinforced the others. This integration created a closed informational environment. Within such an environment, alternative explanations struggled to gain traction. Even when individuals sensed inconsistency, they lacked frameworks to articulate it. Doubt remained private. Critique remained localized. The system remained intact. What eventually altered this balance was not a single revelation, but accumulation. Small changes layered over time began to strain coherence. Literacy expanded incrementally. Trade introduced comparison. Urban life disrupted traditional enforcement. Administrative complexity introduced distance between decision and consequence. Each change alone was manageable. Together, they transformed how people experienced authority. Distance is critical here. Medieval authority had been immediate. One knew who ruled, who judged, who preached. As authority became mediated through documents, procedures, and offices, it grew less personal. This impersonality reduced emotional attachment. Obedience became less reverent and more transactional. Transactional obedience is inherently conditional. People comply as long as systems function. When they fail, loyalty weakens rapidly. Medieval conspiracies, rooted in moral obligation, were more resilient to failure. Early modern systems, rooted in performance, were less forgiving. This shift did not empower individuals overnight, but it altered expectations. Authority was no longer assumed to be right by nature. It was expected to work. Expectation is a subtle but powerful change. Once people expect institutions to deliver outcomes, they implicitly reserve the right to judge those outcomes. Judgment introduces evaluation. Evaluation introduces comparison. Comparison introduces the possibility of alternatives. Medieval conspiracies minimized expectation by framing outcomes as divinely determined. Early modern systems increased expectation by framing outcomes as human-managed. This transition reshaped the relationship between people and power. It also reshaped the nature of conspiratorial thinking. As authority became more fragmented and procedural, suspicion shifted from cosmic narratives to institutional processes. People no longer feared divine punishment as intensely, but they feared hidden interests, corruption, and manipulation within systems. Conspiratorial thought did not disappear. It changed focus. Instead of questioning God's will, people questioned administrators. Instead of fearing heresy, they feared deception. Instead of assuming order was sacred, they suspected it was engineered. This suspicion reflects a loss of trust, but also a gain in awareness. Medieval conspiracies discouraged suspicion by presenting authority as unquestionable. Later systems tolerated suspicion, even incorporated it, as long as it did not threaten core structures. Controlled skepticism became a safety valve. This dynamic illustrates a paradox. Allowing limited doubt can stabilize authority by preventing deeper challenge. Medieval systems rarely allowed this luxury. Their authority depended on unanimity. Modern systems can afford dissent because their legitimacy rests on complexity rather than belief. The medieval period thus represents an earlier, more fragile stage of institutional control. Its conspiracies required emotional investment. They demanded faith. They relied on shared cosmology. When that cosmology fractured, the system had to evolve. This evolution did not liberate society completely, but it diversified forms of control. By examining medieval conspiracies carefully, we see that control is not a singular phenomenon. It manifests differently depending on context. What remains consistent is the relationship between explanation and compliance. People comply when systems make sense. When systems stop making sense, they change. This change does not always benefit everyone equally. New systems create new hierarchies. New narratives legitimize new inequalities. Power shifts, but it does not vanish. Medieval conspiracies remind us that the struggle is not between control and freedom in absolute terms. It is between different configurations of order. Every configuration solves certain problems and creates others. The medieval configuration prioritized spiritual coherence over material flexibility. Later configurations prioritized administrative efficiency over moral clarity. Each choice carried consequences. Understanding this prevents romanticization of either past or present. The medieval world was not uniquely oppressive, nor is the modern world uniquely free. Each is shaped by the conditions that sustain it. History, when approached slowly, dissolves simplistic binaries. It replaces them with patterns. Patterns reveal that conspiracies, in their deepest sense, are not hidden plots but shared understandings that align behavior across populations. They are social technologies refined over time. Medieval Europe provides an early, vivid example of this technology at work. Its conspiracies were visible because their language was explicit. Their symbols were public. Their rituals were collective. This visibility allows us to study them with clarity. Modern systems, by contrast, often obscure their assumptions behind neutrality. This makes medieval history particularly valuable. It offers a stripped-down view of how power operates when it is still learning to hide. As this documentary continues to unfold, the medieval conspiracies we have examined recede further into abstraction. They become less about specific institutions and more about recurring dynamics. Authority seeks stability. Narrative provides legitimacy. Habit ensures continuity. Change emerges when narrative fails to explain experience. Even then, change is slow. This rhythm defines history more reliably than any single event. By listening to medieval history in this way, unhurried, unsensational, attentive to structure, we gain something rare: orientation without illusion. Not certainty, not reassurance, but perspective. And perspective, once gained, quietly reshapes how we see both past and present. Perspective alters not only how we view authority, but how we understand time itself. Medieval conspiracies were experienced as permanent because medieval time felt cyclical rather than progressive. Seasons repeated, rituals returned, generations lived much like those before them. In such a temporal framework, the idea that fundamental structures might dissolve seemed implausible. This sense of permanence strengthened authority. When the future resembles the past, change feels unnecessary, even dangerous. Medieval conspiracies thrived within this temporal stability. They did not need to promise improvement. They promised continuity. Continuity is deeply reassuring. The medieval calendar reinforced this reassurance. Religious festivals marked the passage of time with predictable rhythm. Saints' days, fasting periods, and holy seasons structured life. These rhythms were not merely spiritual. They regulated labor, rest, and community interaction. Time itself became an instrument of order. When authority organizes time, it shapes expectation. People learn when to work, when to rest, when to celebrate, and when to endure hardship. This temporal discipline reduces uncertainty and channels behavior without constant enforcement. Medieval conspiracies were therefore temporal as much as ideological. As Europe moved toward early modernity, this temporal stability weakened. Calendars became less uniform. Work rhythms changed. Commercial schedules disrupted agrarian cycles. Time became increasingly measured, segmented, and standardized. This transformation altered how people experienced life. Measured time emphasizes productivity, efficiency, and planning. It introduces comparison between moments. It encourages evaluation of outcomes. In doing so, it subtly undermines narratives that frame existence as fixed or divinely ordered. The medieval sense of timelessness gave way to a sense of movement. Movement introduces possibility. Possibility introduces choice. Choice introduces responsibility. This chain reaction reshaped authority. Medieval conspiracies had minimized responsibility by attributing outcomes to divine will. As time became more linear and progress-oriented, responsibility shifted toward human decision-making. Failures demanded explanation. Successes demanded justification. Authority became accountable, at least in theory. This accountability, however, did not eliminate conspiratorial dynamics. It relocated them. When responsibility increases, so does the temptation to obscure it. Institutions respond by distributing decision-making, formalizing procedure, and emphasizing process. Outcomes are attributed to systems rather than individuals. This diffusion of responsibility is familiar in modern contexts. Medieval conspiracies had concentrated authority symbolically. Early modern systems diffused it administratively. Both arrangements served to stabilize power, but through different means. The medieval world thus offers insight into the evolution of institutional self-protection. It shows how authority learns to survive scrutiny by reframing itself. When sacred legitimacy falters, procedural legitimacy rises. When belief weakens, routine compensates. When trust declines, complexity increases. Each adaptation preserves the core function of authority while altering its appearance. Understanding this adaptive cycle allows us to see medieval conspiracies not as dead systems, but as prototypes. They represent an early stage in the long development of institutional governance. Their language was religious. Their symbols were overt. Their control mechanisms were visible. Later systems would become more subtle, but the underlying logic remains recognizable. Authority must orient experience. It must reduce uncertainty. It must align explanation with survival. When it fails to do so, it must change. This logic explains why medieval conspiracies did not simply collapse under critique. They adjusted. They narrowed claims. They delegated functions. They integrated opposition. They reasserted relevance. This resilience challenges the idea that enlightenment alone dissolves power. Enlightenment alters the form of power. It does not remove the need for it. Human societies require coordination. Coordination requires authority. Authority requires legitimacy. Legitimacy requires narrative. Medieval conspiracies supplied narrative in a form suited to their time. Later eras would supply different narratives. The mechanism persists. Recognizing this continuity does not diminish historical progress. Contextualizes it. Progress becomes a matter of reconfiguration rather than eradication. Systems become more flexible, less brutal, more inclusive, but they remain systems. The medieval period teaches us that systems endure when they feel natural. They weaken when their naturalness is questioned. But questioning alone is insufficient. It must be accompanied by viable alternatives. Alternatives emerge slowly. They require infrastructure, shared understanding, and new habits. Until these develop, old systems persist, even when their narratives falter. This is why medieval conspiracies remained influential long after belief in their justifications declined. They were embedded in daily practice. Practice outlasts belief. Even today, many practices persist after their original rationale has faded. Traditions continue. Institutions endure. Procedures remain in place because replacing them would require effort, coordination, and risk. The medieval world exemplifies this inertia. Its conspiracies were woven into practice so thoroughly that disentangling them required centuries. Change occurred, but it was incremental. History, viewed this way, is not a series of revelations. It is a process of gradual realignment between explanation and experience. When alignment holds, systems feel stable. When it breaks, systems adapt. Medieval conspiracies remind us that adaptation is not always visible in the moment. It can appear as stagnation, even as transformation unfolds beneath the surface. This insight encourages patience in historical interpretation. It cautions against judging the past by outcomes alone. It invites attention to process, and it suggests that understanding power requires time, not only historical time, but contemplative time. The kind of time this documentary inhabits. Slow, reflective, uninterrupted. In that time, medieval conspiracies lose their sensational edge and reveal their deeper significance. They become windows into how societies construct order, how authority embeds itself in life, and how change emerges from within constraint. They also remind us that the present will one day appear just as provisional. What feels natural now will one day feel constructed. What feels necessary now will one day feel negotiable. History guarantees this, not through inevitability, but through adaptation. And in that adaptation, the patterns we have traced here will continue to repeat, altered in form, familiar in function. When what feels natural is revealed to be constructed, societies rarely respond with clarity. More often, they respond with unease. Medieval Europe experienced this unease not as a sudden shock, but as a low, persistent tension that grew across generations. Old explanations still functioned, but less convincingly. New explanations emerged, but without full authority. Life continued in the space between. This in-between condition is where many conspiratorial dynamics intensify. When no single narrative fully explains experience, people search for coherence. They gravitate toward explanations that restore a sense of order, even if those explanations are partial or symbolic. Medieval conspiracies evolved during this phase, becoming more defensive, more localized, and more rigid in certain areas even as they loosened in others. This unevenness is important. Authority does not retreat uniformly. It reinforces pressure where it feels most threatened and relaxes where compliance seems secure. In late medieval Europe, this meant heightened concern over belief, morality, and social discipline, even as economic and administrative practices quietly transformed. The result was contradiction. Institutions preached eternal order while adapting to change. They condemned deviation while negotiating compromise. They asserted timeless authority while relying increasingly on pragmatic solutions. To modern observers, such contradiction appears hypocritical. To those living within it, it felt like necessity. Necessity often justifies inconsistency. This is one of the defining characteristics of conspiratorial systems under strain. They preserve their symbolic core while altering their operational reality. The narrative remains stable even as practice shifts. Medieval conspiracies illustrate this with remarkable clarity. For example, hierarchy continued to be presented as divinely ordained even as wealth, influence, and power began to circulate beyond traditional elites. The narrative of fixed order persisted, but the lived experience of order became more fluid. This dissonance did not immediately produce rejection. Instead, it produced accommodation. People learned to navigate the gap between what was said and what was done. Navigation became a skill. In such environments, survival depends on interpretation. Knowing when to conform, when to adapt, and when to remain silent becomes essential. Medieval people were not passive recipients of authority. They were active interpreters of it. This interpretive labor is often overlooked. Conspiratorial systems do not eliminate agency. They channel it. They constrain the range of acceptable action while leaving room for negotiation within boundaries. Medieval Europe was full of such negotiation. Customs were bent. Rules were selectively enforced. Exceptions were granted. Authority was not absolute in practice, even when presented as such in theory. This flexibility allowed conspiratorial systems to endure without constant violence. Violence was present, but it was episodic rather than continuous. Most enforcement occurred through expectation, reputation, and habit. These are quieter tools but more effective over time. Silence played a crucial role here. Much of medieval compliance was never spoken aloud. It was assumed. The absence of protest was interpreted as agreement. The absence of alternatives was interpreted as confirmation. This silence was not always imposed. It was often internalized. When questioning feels futile or dangerous, silence becomes rational. Over time, silence becomes normal. Normalized silence is one of the strongest reinforcements of authority. Medieval conspiracies thrived on this silence. They did not require unanimous belief. They required the absence of sustained challenge. Silence ensured continuity. This insight complicates modern expectations of resistance. We often imagine that injustice naturally produces opposition. Medieval history suggests otherwise. Injustice can persist for centuries when it is normalized, rationalized, and woven into survival. Opposition emerges not simply from suffering, but from misalignment, when suffering no longer fits the explanation provided. This misalignment eventually became unavoidable. As medieval Europe changed, suffering took new forms that old narratives struggled to explain. Economic hardship affected groups previously protected. Disease struck indiscriminately. Social mobility disrupted assumptions about virtue and reward. The narrative of divinely ordered hierarchy weakened not because it was exposed as false, but because it became inadequate. Inadequacy undermines legitimacy more effectively than contradiction. People can tolerate contradiction if a system still functions. They cannot tolerate inadequacy indefinitely. This distinction helps explain why medieval conspiracies lasted as long as they did. They functioned not perfectly, not justly, but coherently enough to organize life. When coherence faded, authority adapted rather than collapsed. Adaptation often involved narrowing responsibility. Institutions claimed authority over specific domains rather than universal truth. This reduced vulnerability. Failures could be compartmentalized. Such compartmentalization marks a transition toward modern governance. It also marks a transition in conspiratorial thinking. Instead of grand cosmic explanations, people began to suspect localized manipulation. Instead of divine punishment, they feared human exploitation. Instead of eternal order, they confronted contingency. Contingency is unsettling. It implies that outcomes could have been otherwise. It introduces the possibility of choice. Choice introduces responsibility. Responsibility invites judgment. Medieval conspiracies minimized contingency. They framed outcomes as necessary. Later systems struggled to do the same. This struggle continues. Every era seeks narratives that make life feel intelligible. When those narratives fail, new ones emerge. They may be more complex, more technical, more fragmented, but they serve the same purpose. The medieval period shows us this process in an early, visible form. These conspiracies were not hidden machinations. They were shared understandings that aligned behavior across society. They offered meaning in exchange for compliance. They offered order in exchange for submission. This exchange was rarely articulated as a choice. It was experienced as reality. Understanding this reframes how we think about conspiracy itself. It shifts the focus away from secrecy and toward structure. It suggests that the most influential conspiracies are those that shape what feels normal. Medieval conspiracies did exactly that. They normalized hierarchy. They normalized suffering. They normalized obedience. And they did so by embedding these norms into time, ritual, language, and habit. As these norms weakened, they were not replaced overnight. They were reconfigured. Their language changed. Their symbols faded. Their mechanisms persisted. This continuity is the deeper story of medieval conspiracies. Not that they deceived people, but that they organized meaning. And meaning, once organized, becomes difficult to dislodge. As this documentary continues, the medieval world increasingly recedes into abstraction. What remains is not a list of institutions or beliefs, but a pattern of interaction between authority, narrative, and survival. This pattern does not belong to one era. It belongs to history itself. And recognizing it does not require alarm, only attention. Attention, sustained over long stretches of time, reveals something that quick judgment cannot. Authority rarely disappears, but it often changes the way it asks to be believed. Medieval conspiracies did not end because people suddenly rejected obedience. They ended because obedience was reinterpreted. In the medieval world, obedience was framed as alignment with cosmic order. To obey was to live correctly within the structure of creation itself. As this framing weakened, obedience did not vanish. It was reframed as practicality. One obeyed not because it was divinely ordained, but because it was necessary to function within society. This reframing marked a profound psychological shift. When obedience is sacred, it is absolute. When obedience is practical, it is conditional. People comply while evaluating outcomes. They follow rules while quietly measuring cost and benefit. This evaluation introduces distance between individual and institution. Distance alters power. Medieval conspiracies minimize distance by embedding authority in identity. To disobey was not merely to act differently. It was to be different. It was to step outside the moral community. As authority became less moralized and more administrative, disobedience became less existential. This did not make resistance easy, but it made it imaginable. Imagination is the first step toward change. The medieval period shows us how imagination is constrained not by force alone, but by narrative saturation. When a single explanation dominates every domain of life, alternatives cannot be conceived. As narratives fragment, imagination expands. Fragmentation, however, brings instability. People accustomed to comprehensive explanations often experience fragmentation as loss. The old system, for all its constraints, provided a unified story. New systems offer multiple partial explanations. Meaning becomes distributed rather than centralized. This distribution can feel disorienting. Disorientation invites nostalgia. One of the less discussed consequences of medieval conspiracies is the longing they produced once they weakened. As certainty faded, some people sought to restore it. Movements arose that promised renewal, purification, or return to perceived origins. These movements often intensified elements of the old system rather than abandoning it. This pattern recurs across history. When authority fragments, some respond by demanding greater uniformity. When narratives weaken, some seek stronger ones. Medieval conspiracies thus did not simply dissolve into freedom. They gave rise to counter-movements that sought to reassert order. These efforts were rarely successful in restoring the past, but they influenced the shape of the future. Authority learned from these tensions. It learned to balance coherence with flexibility. It learned to tolerate limited diversity while preserving core control. It learned to allow variation without surrendering structure. These lessons informed later institutional design. The medieval world was, in many ways, a laboratory for authority. Its conspiracies were experiments in large-scale coordination under conditions of scarcity and uncertainty. Some elements failed. Others proved adaptable. Understanding this experimental quality prevents us from treating medieval conspiracies as moral aberrations. They were responses to specific challenges. Their longevity reflects their effectiveness within those constraints. Effectiveness, however, does not equate to justice. Medieval conspiracies maintained order, but often at the cost of inequality and suffering. They stabilized society by distributing hardship unevenly and explaining that distribution as necessary. This trade-off is central to understanding their appeal and their harm. The explanation of suffering is one of the most powerful tools of authority. When suffering is framed as meaningful, people endure it. When it is framed as unavoidable, people adapt to it. When it is framed as temporary, people tolerate it. Medieval conspiracies employed all three framings. As these framings lost credibility, suffering became harder to justify. Institutions responded by narrowing responsibility and emphasizing process. Suffering became an unfortunate outcome rather than a moral lesson. This reframing altered how people related to hardship. They began to ask not only why suffering existed, but whether it could be reduced. This question marks a shift from acceptance to evaluation. Evaluation, once widespread, undermines unquestioned authority. Medieval conspiracies delayed evaluation by embedding suffering in cosmology. Later systems would delay it by embedding suffering in complexity. Both strategies serve similar ends. The medieval period thus illuminates a recurring tension between explanation and accountability. Authority seeks explanations that deflect accountability. People seek explanations that restore meaning. When these align, systems endure. When they diverge, tension increases. History unfolds within this tension. Medieval conspiracies resolved it through theology. Later systems would resolve it through administration, law, or economics. Each resolution reflects the dominant tools of its time. Recognizing this allows us to see conspiracy not as an anomaly, but as a structural feature of governance. Not because leaders conspire in secret, but because systems require narratives that reconcile power with participation. Medieval Europe makes this visible. Its conspiracies were not hidden behind technical language or procedural opacity. They were taught openly, reinforced ritually, and lived daily. Their visibility allows us to analyze mechanisms that later become less accessible. This is why medieval history remains so valuable for reflection. It strips power of modern camouflage. It shows authority in a form that is easier to see, easier to trace, and easier to understand. From that understanding, we can extrapolate forward. The lesson is not that modern systems are identical to medieval ones. It is that they share a family resemblance. Both organize life, both normalize inequality, both rely on narratives, both adapt when challenged, and both feel natural until they do not. As this documentary continues, the medieval conspiracies we have examined become less about specific beliefs and more about enduring dynamics. They reveal how societies negotiate order, how authority legitimizes itself, and how change emerges from misalignment rather than exposure. This understanding does not tell us what to do. It tells us what to notice, and noticing patiently and without urgency is the beginning of historical insight. Noticing what feels natural is often more difficult than noticing what feels imposed. Medieval conspiracies endured because they succeeded in making authority indistinguishable from normal life. Power did not announce itself as power. It appeared as tradition, as routine, as the simple fact of how the world worked. This indistinguishability is the highest achievement of any enduring system. In medieval Europe, children grew into authority long before they understood it. They learned roles through imitation rather than instruction. They absorbed hierarchy through family structure, labor expectations, and religious ritual. By the time they were capable of questioning, the system had already shaped their instincts. Instinct is more powerful than belief. Beliefs can be challenged. Instincts feel self-evident. Medieval conspiracies relied heavily on this instinctive transmission. Authority was not argued for, it was demonstrated. Every interaction reinforced it. Who spoke first? Who bowed? Who worked? Who judged? These signals accumulated into a coherent social grammar. Once learned, this grammar governed behavior without conscious thought. This unconscious compliance is one of the most important features of medieval conspiracies. It reduced the need for enforcement. People policed themselves because deviation felt wrong before it felt dangerous. Wrongness precedes fear. By moralizing structure, medieval systems ensured that disobedience carried emotional cost. Shame, guilt, and isolation were often more effective than punishment. These emotions internalized authority, embedding it within the individual. Internalized authority is resilient. It persists even when external enforcement weakens. It continues to shape behavior in the absence of supervision. Medieval conspiracies thrived on this internalization. As belief weakened in later centuries, internalization remained. People no longer feared divine punishment as intensely, but they retained habits of deference, obedience, and self-censorship. Authority had already done its work. This legacy extended far beyond the medieval period. Even as institutions transformed, the behavioral patterns they had cultivated persisted. People accustomed to hierarchy sought guidance. People accustomed to obedience complied with new rules. People accustomed to explanation accepted new narratives. This continuity demonstrates that conspiratorial systems do not need to persist institutionally to remain influential. They persist culturally. Culture outlives institutions. The medieval church lost much of its authority in later centuries, but the mental frameworks it established endured. Concepts of duty, sacrifice, obedience, and moral worth continued to shape behavior even in secular contexts. This transfer of moral logic is one of the most subtle legacies of medieval conspiracies. It illustrates how systems reproduce themselves across time by migrating into new domains. What was once religious becomes ethical. What was once hierarchical becomes professional. What was once divine becomes procedural. The form changes. The function remains. Understanding this migration helps explain why medieval conspiracies still resonate with modern audiences. They are not simply historical curiosities. They are ancestors of familiar structures. The medieval world teaches us that power does not need to be oppressive in every moment to be effective. It needs only to shape defaults. It needs to define what is expected, respectable, and normal. Once defaults are established, deviation becomes costly. Medieval conspiracies defined defaults with remarkable success. They established clear expectations for behavior, belief, and aspiration. Most people lived within these expectations not because they were forced to, but because alternatives were unclear, risky, or unimaginable. Imagination, again, is central. Where imagination is constrained, power feels natural. Where imagination expands, power must adapt. The medieval period shows us both sides of this process. It reveals how imagination can be narrowed through narrative saturation and widened through exposure, comparison, and change. Importantly, imagination does not expand evenly. It expands in pockets. Some individuals imagine alternatives while others remain anchored to tradition. This uneven expansion produces tension rather than revolution. Tension, not collapse, is the usual state of societies in transition. Medieval Europe lived in this tension for centuries. Old and new coexisted. Sacred and pragmatic overlapped. Authority was both revered and resented. Life continued amid contradiction. This coexistence is often misunderstood as stagnation. In reality, it is adaptation. Systems rarely break cleanly. They stretch. They absorb pressure. They shift incrementally. Medieval conspiracies illustrate this stretching process. They show how authority adjusts without surrendering core advantages. They show how narratives are revised to maintain relevance. They show how control persists through flexibility. Flexibility is not weakness. It is survival. The ability to accommodate limited change while preserving structure is what allowed medieval conspiracies to endure as long as they did. It is also what allowed later systems to inherit their legacy. Understanding this challenges the expectation that exposure alone dismantles power. Exposure may weaken belief, but without alternatives, behavior often remains unchanged. Behavior changes when new habits form. Habits require time, coordination, and reinforcement. Medieval conspiracies were powerful because they controlled these elements. They shaped daily routines. They regulated social interaction. They organized time and labor. Replacing such systems required more than ideas. It required new infrastructures of life. This is why transformation took centuries. As listeners absorb this history slowly, the medieval world begins to feel less distant. Its mechanisms resemble familiar patterns. The struggles echo ongoing dilemmas. Its conspiracies mirror structural features that persist under different names. This recognition does not lead to cynicism. It leads to clarity. Clarity allows us to distinguish between authority that serves coordination and authority that demands submission without accountability. It allows us to notice when narratives explain reality and when they obscure it. Medieval conspiracies, viewed calmly and without sensationalism, provide a rare opportunity to practice this distinction. They are distant enough to examine honestly. They are familiar enough to matter. And in the quiet space of long-form history, they reveal their true significance, not as secrets uncovered, but as systems understood. To understand systems rather than secrets is to approach history with a different set of expectations. Medieval conspiracies were not dramatic revelations waiting to be uncovered. They were frameworks that quietly shaped how people thought, acted, and understood their world. Their power lay in persistence, not surprise. Persistence operates through repetition. In medieval Europe, repetition was everywhere. The same prayers spoken daily, the same rituals performed annually, the same social roles enacted across generations. This repetition did more than reinforce belief. It created familiarity. Familiarity reduced friction. What was repeated became unquestioned. Questioning disrupts rhythm. When rhythms are disrupted, systems react defensively. Medieval conspiracies responded to disruption not only through punishment, but through reassertion of routine. Festivals were emphasized during times of crisis. Rituals were intensified. Authority was made visible through ceremony. Visibility reassured. Ceremony reminds people that order still exists, even when circumstances suggest otherwise. Medieval rulers understood this instinctively. Coronations, processions, and public rituals were not merely symbolic. They were stabilizing technologies. They made power tangible. When power is tangible, it feels real. When it feels real, it feels unavoidable. Medieval conspiracies relied on this tangibility. Authority could be seen, heard, and touched. Churches dominated skylines. Bells marked time. Law was enacted in public spaces. This physical presence anchored abstract ideas in daily experience. As authority became less tangible in later centuries, it compensated with complexity. Rules replaced rituals. Documents replaced proclamations. Offices replaced persons. Power became harder to see, but no less influential. Medieval conspiracies thus represent a phase when authority was still embodied. This embodiment makes them easier to analyze. Their mechanisms are visible. Their assumptions are explicit. Modern systems often obscure these mechanisms behind neutrality. This contrast is instructive. It shows that transparency does not automatically lead to accountability. Medieval authority was transparent in form but unquestionable in function. Modern authority may be opaque in form but negotiable in theory. The medieval experience reminds us that visibility alone is not liberation. Liberation, if it occurs, emerges from the alignment of multiple conditions: alternative narratives, viable infrastructures, and collective imagination. Medieval conspiracies limited all three. They restricted narrative by saturating culture with a single explanation. They restricted infrastructure by concentrating resources. They restricted imagination by framing alternatives as dangerous or immoral. As these restrictions loosened, change became possible. But possibility did not immediately become reality. The gap between possibility and reality is where most historical tension resides. Medieval Europe lived in that gap for centuries. New ideas circulated slowly. New practices emerged unevenly. Old structures persisted alongside innovations. This coexistence produced ambiguity. Ambiguity weakens certainty, but it also allows adaptation. People learned to navigate contradictory expectations. They complied outwardly while adjusting privately. They interpreted rules flexibly. They survived. Survival often looks like compliance from a distance. This complicates moral narratives of resistance. Medieval conspiracies did not face constant rebellion because rebellion was rarely viable. Instead, they faced quiet negotiation. Negotiation is less visible than revolt, but more common. It occurs in daily decisions: how strictly to follow a rule, when to bend custom, whom to appease, whom to avoid. These micro-adjustments shape how systems function in practice. Medieval conspiracies were shaped by countless such adjustments. Authority was never as absolute as doctrine suggested. It was always mediated by circumstance. This mediation allowed systems to persist by absorbing pressure. Absorption is a key feature of resilient power. Systems that cannot absorb strain break. Systems that can adapt endure. Medieval conspiracies endured because they adapted, even when adaptation contradicted their own narratives. This contradiction was tolerated because coherence mattered more than consistency. As long as the system worked well enough, inconsistencies could be ignored. People prioritize function over logic. This priority remains constant across history. When systems provide food, security, and predictability, people tolerate imperfections. When systems fail to do so, tolerance erodes rapidly. Medieval conspiracies functioned sufficiently for long periods. When they ceased to do so, change accelerated. This acceleration, however, still unfolded within inherited constraints. New systems borrowed old habits. New narratives repurposed familiar language. Authority evolved rather than disappeared. Understanding this evolutionary process prevents oversimplification. It reminds us that power is not a static enemy to be defeated, but a dynamic relationship to be managed. It changes as conditions change. It survives by learning. Medieval conspiracies were part of this learning process. They reveal early strategies of large-scale coordination, moralization, ritualization, narrative saturation, and habit formation. Later systems refined these strategies. They made them less visible, more procedural, and more abstract. The medieval world offers clarity precisely because its strategies were overt. By studying them patiently, we gain insight into mechanisms that persist under different guises. This insight does not demand suspicion of every institution. It demands discernment. Discernment involves asking not only what a system claims, but how it shapes behavior. Not only what narratives it promotes, but what alternatives it makes difficult. Medieval conspiracies shaped behavior by defining normality. They made obedience ordinary. They made hierarchy expected. They made suffering intelligible. When these definitions weakened, they were replaced, not erased. The medieval period thus teaches us that history is less about endings than about transitions. Systems do not vanish. They transform. Narratives do not disappear. They migrate. Understanding this continuity helps us approach the present with nuance. It cautions against assuming that exposure alone leads to freedom. It suggests that meaningful change requires new habits, new infrastructures, and new ways of organizing meaning. Medieval conspiracies remind us how deeply embedded such organization can become. They also remind us that no system, however natural it feels, is permanent. What feels inevitable now once felt unimaginable. What feels normal now will one day feel constructed. History ensures this, not through sudden revelation, but through slow accumulation. And in that accumulation, attention, patient, sustained attention, becomes the most valuable tool we have.